My name is Alethea Paul. I am 31 years old and a lead forensic financial auditor. For my entire life, my parents treated my brother David like a deity because he held a scalpel, while treating my law degree and CPA like a clerical error. They poured their pride into his neurosurgery fellowship, treating him to Michelin star dinners and business class flights. I was just the daughter who asked too many uncomfortable questions. In Minnesota, we have a culture built on polite smiles and buried secrets. People call it Minnesota nice. It means you never raise your voice, you bake a casserole for the neighbors, and you exile anyone who points out the rot under the floorboards. On a freezing Tuesday morning in November, my phone buzzed on the granite kitchen counter. Outside, the frost traced jagged patterns over the glass, hiding the Minneapolis skyline. Inside, the screen glowed with a message from my older sister, Vanessa. "Hey, sweetie. Mom and Dad and I were chatting, and we think it is best if you sit this Thanksgiving out. We want a cozy, drama-free holiday at the cabin this year. You always bring up heavy work things, and David really needs to decompress from his hospital rotation. Let us grab coffee in January." 3 seconds later, our mother Susan hearted the message in the group chat. Our father Richard sent a thumbs up. Before I tell you how I dismantled their perfect suburban illusion, drop your age in the comments and welcome to Morning Revenge. I did not reply. I did not cry. I picked up my ceramic coffee mug, feeling the residual heat against my palms. I stared at the cheerful yellow heart on the screen. They wanted a pristine holiday at the Wayzata Lakeside cabin. They wanted the roaring stone fireplace, the matching cashmere sweaters, and the neighbors dropping by to admire David and his surgical scrub tan. My analytical gaze ruined their lighting. To them, I was the drama starter because last year I quietly asked my father why his custom import business showed glaring signs of a liquidity deficit. They believed their wealth was an impenetrable fortress. What they did not know was that the fortress belonged to me. I set the mug down and walked into my home office. The room was dark, except for the glow of 3 high-resolution monitors. I sat at my desk and let my fingers fly across the mechanical keyboard, entering my encrypted credentials into a secure commercial banking portal. The screen loaded a corporate account held under a blind entity named Apex Holdings. 4 years ago, my father fell 60 days behind on the cabin mortgage. His pride would never let him admit he was failing. He was terrified the country club set would find out. I stepped in behind a corporate veil. For 48 months, this account had silently drafted $5,400 on the first of every month, sending the funds directly to the primary lender. They thought a faceless corporate restructuring program had bought their debt and granted them a quiet, endless grace period. They thought their elite status was secure by sheer luck. They uninvited me because I made them feel inadequate. They threw me out of the house I was paying for. I navigated to the Scheduled Transfers tab. The cursor hovered over the recurring monthly draft. They wanted a peaceful holiday without my shadow falling across their hearth. I clicked Cancel Scheduled Payment. A confirmation box popped up, warning that halting the transfer would result in immediate delinquency for the associated property deed. I clicked Confirm. The ledger zeroed out. The financial lifeline severed. The bank system would flag the default in a matter of days, long before the turkey was ever carved. The brutal winter cold was finally coming for their precious Wayzata cabin, and I intended to let them freeze. My name is Alethea Paul. I am 31 years old and a lead forensic financial auditor. For my entire life, my parents treated my brother David like a deity because he held a scalpel while treating my law degree and CPA like a clerical error. They poured their pride into his neurosurgery fellowship, treating him to Michelin star dinners and business class flights. I was just the daughter who asked too many uncomfortable questions. In Minnesota, we have a culture built on polite smiles and buried secrets. People call it Minnesota nice. It means you never raise your voice, you bake a casserole for the neighbors, and you exile anyone who points out the rot under the floorboards. On a freezing Tuesday morning in November, my phone buzzed on the granite kitchen counter. Outside, the frost traced jagged patterns over the glass, hiding the Minneapolis skyline. Inside, the screen glowed with a message from my older sister Vanessa. "Hey, sweetie. Mom and Dad and I were chatting, and we think it is best if you sit this Thanksgiving out. We want a cozy, drama-free holiday at the cabin this year. You always bring up heavy work things, and David really needs to decompress from his hospital rotation. Let us grab coffee in January." 3 seconds later, our mother Susan hearted the message in the group chat. Our father Richard sent a thumbs up. Before I tell you how I dismantled their perfect suburban illusion, drop your age in the comments and welcome to morning revenge. I did not reply. I did not cry. I picked up my ceramic coffee mug, feeling the residual heat against my palms. I stared at the cheerful yellow heart on the screen. They wanted a pristine holiday at the Wayzata Lakeside cabin. They wanted the roaring stone fireplace, the matching cashmere sweaters, and the neighbors dropping by to admire David and his surgical scrub tan. My analytical gaze ruined their lighting. To them, I was the drama starter, because last year I quietly asked my father why his custom import business showed glaring signs of a liquidity deficit. They believed their wealth was an impenetrable fortress. What they did not know was that the fortress belonged to me. I set the mug down and walked into my home office. The room was dark except for the glow of 3 high-resolution monitors. I sat at my desk and let my fingers fly across the mechanical keyboard, entering my encrypted credentials into a secure commercial banking portal. The screen loaded a corporate account held under a blind entity named Apex Holdings. 4 years ago, my father fell 60 days behind on the cabin mortgage. His pride would never let him admit he was failing. He was terrified the country club set would find out. I stepped in behind a corporate veil. For 48 months, this account had silently drafted $5,400 on the first of every month, sending the funds directly to the primary lender. They thought a faceless corporate restructuring program had bought their debt and granted them a quiet, endless grace period. They thought their elite status was secure by sheer luck. They uninvited me because I made them feel inadequate. They threw me out of the house I was paying for. I navigated to the Scheduled Transfers tab. The cursor hovered over the recurring monthly draft. They wanted a peaceful holiday without my shadow falling across their hearth. I clicked Cancel Scheduled Payment. A confirmation box popped up, warning that halting the transfer would result in immediate delinquency for the associated property deed. I clicked Confirm. The ledger zeroed out. The financial lifeline severed. The bank system would flag the default in a matter of days, long before the turkey was ever carved. The brutal winter cold was finally coming for their precious Wayzata cabin, and I intended to let them freeze. 2 weeks passed. 14 days of calculated silence from my family. I spent those days in my downtown office, tracing offshore shell corporations and unraveling embezzled funds for corporate clients. My mind thrived in the structured universe of ledgers where numbers never lied and every debt eventually came due. I treated my personal life with the same clinical precision. I knew exactly how long the banking machinery took to react. A missed electronic transfer triggers an automated grace period flag. After 10 days, the system generates a formal notice. On the 14th day, a physical piece of mail leaves a sorting facility destined for the property address. Outside my condo, the Minnesota winter arrived with a punishing force. A blizzard swept across the plains, burying Minneapolis under a thick blanket of ice and snow. The wind howled against my reinforced windows, rattling the glass in its frames. The temperature plummeted well below zero. It was the kind of storm that kept sensible people indoors, huddled around radiators. At 10 minutes past midnight, the intercom in my kitchen chimed. The sharp sound pierced the quiet of my apartment. I checked the security feed on my tablet. A dark gray luxury SUV sat idling in my driveway, its headlights cutting through the blinding snow. A figure stepped out, leaving the driver's side door open to the elements. It was my father. I walked to the front door and unlocked the deadbolt. Richard Paul stood on my welcome mat. Snow piled on the shoulders of his expensive wool overcoat. His face was flushed red. It was not the cold painting his cheeks. It was sheer, unadulterated panic, laced with rage. He pushed past me without a greeting. His wet leather shoes squeaked against my hardwood floors, leaving a trail of melting slush. He did not take off his coat. He marched straight to my kitchen island and reached into his inner pocket. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and slapped it down onto the granite countertop. I recognized the heavy stock paper and the ominous bold font of the primary lender. It was the notice of default. I looked closer. Due to a system update at the bank, a clerical error had occurred in their mail merge software. Instead of printing the anonymous corporate entity Apex Holdings LLC, the letterhead displayed the primary manager registry. It read, Apex Holdings LLC, care of Alethea Paul. My father planted his hands on the counter, leaning toward me. His breath smelled of stale coffee and panic. "You want to explain this to me, Alethea?" he asked. His voice was a harsh whisper. He was terrified the neighbors in my building might hear him. Even in a blizzard, optics mattered more than anything. I read the notice. "The payment was missed, Dad. The account is delinquent." He slammed his palm against the granite. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "Do not patronize me," he hissed. "You bought my debt. You have been sneaking around behind my back for 4 years, holding my mortgage over my head. Who do you think you are?" I looked at him. I did not see a father demanding respect. I saw a debtor caught in a lie. I stood my ground, folding my arms across my chest. "I kept a roof over your head," I said, keeping my voice level. 4 years ago, you were 2 months behind. You were liquidating your retirement just to keep up appearances at the country club. I created a blind trust to pay the arrears and manage the monthly installments so you would not have to face a foreclosure auction. "You humiliated me," he countered, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You treated me like one of your forensic case files. If you had the cash, why did you not just write me a check? Why the shell game? Why pretend to be a bank?" The hypocrisy hung in the cold air between us. My father ran a custom import business that peaked in the late 90s. He spent the last decade taking out high-interest business loans just to maintain his lifestyle. He insisted on funding my brother David and his expensive medical fellowships, flying him first class across the country, buying him expensive watches to celebrate his surgical milestones. If I had simply handed my father a check for $5,000 every month, he would never have applied it to the principal balance of the Wyzetta cabin. He would have spent it on maintaining the golden facade. He would have handed it to David. "If I gave you cash, you would have spent it on dinners and country club dues," I told him directly. "I secured the asset. I kept you from going bankrupt." His jaw clenched. The truth was a mirror he refused to look into. He paced the length of my kitchen, running a hand through his thinning hair. The anger in his eyes began to shift, morphing into a cold, calculating desperation. He needed to regain control. He needed to restore the patriarchal hierarchy that my financial independence had shattered. He stopped pacing and turned back to me. He smoothed the lapels of his wet coat, attempting to summon his old business authority. "Fine," he said, his tone dropping into a forced diplomatic register. "You made your point. You played the savior, but this arrangement is unnatural. A daughter should not hold financial leverage over her father. It disrupts the family dynamic. It makes things weird, Alethea." I stared at him, waiting for the actual demand. I knew my father. The Minnesota nice facade was returning. He was about to ask for something outrageous, wrapped in polite phrasing. "We need to correct this power dynamic," he continued, tapping his fingers on the granite. "I want you to sign the LLC over to Vanessa and Greg." The silence in the kitchen became suffocating. I processed his words, matching them against logical reality. "You want me to transfer a multi-million-dollar asset that I paid for to my sister and her husband?" I asked. "Yes," he said, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. Greg is a real estate visionary. He understands property management. He knows how to leverage assets. If the cabin is in Greg and Vanessa's name, it keeps the equity in the proper hands. Greg can manage the payments moving forward. It will restore the balance. No more sneaking around, no more drama. The audacity of the demand settled into my bones like frost. He did not want to pay me back. He did not want to thank me. He wanted to confiscate my wealth and hand it to his preferred son-in-law to hide his own shame. He was asking me to quietly surrender my property so he could pretend a successful man rescued him rather than the daughter he routinely dismissed. Greg is a visionary, I repeated, keeping my face an unreadable mask. He has a brilliant mind for this. Richard insisted, leaning closer. He is an investor. He knows how to make capital work. You just stare at spreadsheets all day. You do not understand the broader market. Sign the transfer papers, Alethea. Let Greg fix this. We can put this whole ugly misunderstanding behind us, and you can come to Thanksgiving dinner. I looked at the wrinkled default notice on the counter. My mind shifted gears, falling into the rhythm of a fraud examiner. My father believed Greg was a wealthy investor. Vanessa portrayed her life as an endless stream of leased Range Rovers and luxury vacations. But real wealth does not need to confiscate assets from a sibling to balance a portfolio. If Greg was such a brilliant visionary, why did he need my blind trust handed to him for free? A sharp instinct flared in my chest. A forensic auditor learns to trust the discrepancies. The numbers never lie, but people always do. My father was desperate to hide his failure behind Greg. But what was Greg hiding behind my father? I will think about the transfer, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. Richard nodded, satisfied that his authority had reined me in. He buttoned his coat, offering a tight, passive-aggressive smile. "Do not take too long," he said, turning toward the door. "We need this resolved before the holiday. Family comes first, Alethea. Remember that." He walked out into the blizzard, leaving the front door slightly ajar. I stood in the quiet kitchen, listening to the crunch of his tires as he backed out of the driveway. I did not feel hurt. I felt a cold, hyper-focused clarity. I walked back to my home office and woke up my computer monitors. I opened a new encrypted search window. I typed Greg, full legal name, into the public records database. I was going to find out exactly what kind of visionary my brother-in-law really was. The image was a masterpiece of suburban propaganda. Vanessa was the quintessential golden child of our affluent community. She drove a leased white Range Rover. She curated an endless feed of matching holiday pajamas, and she presided over the local country club charity committees with a pristine grip. Greg played his part flawlessly. He portrayed himself as a self-made tech investor, a man who supposedly funded software startups before they went public. He wore tailored fleece vests and spoke in buzzwords about disruptive market synergies. My parents paraded Greg around their social circles as the ideal son-in-law. They treated my brother David with breathless reverence because he was a neurosurgery fellow saving lives at the hospital. They treated Greg with loud boasts because he supposedly made money in his sleep. Meanwhile, my law degree and my CPA license were ignored. I was just the cynical auditor who lived alone in the city. I set my phone face down on the granite counter. The screen went dark. The contrast between their curated digital joy and the freezing panic my father exhibited in my kitchen just hours prior was stark. They were building a house of cards on a frozen lake, and the ice was cracking. My phone vibrated again. This time, it was an incoming call. The caller identification displayed my sister name. I let it ring 3 times. I took a slow breath of the dry winter air inside my condo. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the device to my ear. "Hey, sweetie," Vanessa chirped. Her voice dripped with saccharine sweetness. It was the exact tone she used when she wanted to ask a favor, but needed it to sound like she was doing me a favor. "Hello, Vanessa," I replied, keeping my voice flat and professional. Listen, she continued, her words tumbling out in a practiced rhythm. Dad came over this morning. He told me you two had a tiny disagreement last night about some property management paperwork. You know how he gets when he is stressed about the holidays. We hate fighting, Alethea. We are family. I was talking to Mom, and we want to offer a truce. A truce? I echoed. Yes, Vanessa said, her tone brightening artificially. We want you to come to Thanksgiving. Not for the main dinner, of course. David is bringing his chief of surgery, and we want to keep the table intimate for his networking. But you can come for dessert. We are having artisan pumpkin pie around 8. You can sit by the fire with us. The audacity hung in the air. They were offering me a slice of pie in the house I had secretly financed for 4 years. They were inviting me to the aftermath of a dinner they had banned me from. But I knew Minnesota nice. A concession this generous never came without a steep hidden price. That sounds very specific, Vanessa, I said. What is the occasion for this sudden change of heart? She let out a light, breathy laugh. Well, since you and Dad are doing all this weird restructuring with the cabin, Greg and I have a tiny favor to ask. Greg is finalizing a bridge loan for his latest venture capital acquisition. It is a sure thing, a total gold mine. But because his liquid capital is tied up in overseas tech incubators, the underwriters are asking for a secondary domestic guarantor. Just a formality. I stared out my frosted window at the frozen river below. I remained entirely silent, letting her words echo. Dad said your credit is perfect, Vanessa pressed her voice, dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. He said you have verifiable liquid assets. If you co-sign this short-term loan for Greg, we can put all this silly cabin drama behind us. We can just be a happy family again. Greg will pay it off in 3 months. You will not even have to do anything. The sheer boldness of the demand was staggering. My sister was enforcing my social exile from our family Thanksgiving dinner, while simultaneously demanding I risk my own financial security to fund her husband. They believed my wealth was a communal asset meant to prop up their illusions. Send me the loan origination documents, I said, keeping my voice devoid of any warmth. I will review the terms. Oh, thank you, sweetie, Vanessa squealed. Greg will email them right now. See you on Thursday for pie. She ended the call. I lowered the phone. The quiet of my apartment returned, replaced only by the low hum of my central heating system. I walked into my home office and sat down at my desk. I woke up my 3 monitors. As a certified fraud examiner, I possessed a very specific set of skills. People lie constantly. They lie on social media, they lie at family dinners, and they lie on phone calls. But tax returns, corporate registries, and lien filings exist in a universe of cold, hard truth. I opened my secure email client. A message from Greg arrived, containing a single, unencrypted, portable document format file. It was a standard commercial loan application. The requested amount was staggering. The interest rate was exorbitant, indicating the lender categorized Greg as a supreme risk. I did not care about the loan application. I cared about the financial footprint Greg left behind. I logged into a specialized legal and financial database. I typed in his full legal name, his current Wyzetta address, and his social security number, which he had foolishly left unredacted on the application form. I hit enter. The screen populated with hundreds of rows of data. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands. The digital paper trail unfurled before me. Greg was not a tech visionary. He was a sinking stone. I clicked on his primary corporate entity. The registration traced back to a registered agent located in a strip mall in Delaware. I pulled the state tax records. The entity had reported 0 revenue for the past 3 fiscal cycles. I ran a search on his secondary holding companies. 2 were suspended by the Franchise Tax Board for failure to file annual reports. 1 was currently embroiled in active litigation for defaulting on a commercial lease. I opened the public court dockets for his home county. Greg had 3 outstanding civil judgments against him from unpaid independent contractors. His credit cards were maxed out across 7 different banking institutions. My brother-in-law was utterly bankrupt. The leased Range Rover, the tailored vests, the expensive dinners at the country club were all funded by a frantic, unsustainable cycle of high-interest debt. He was running a personal Ponzi scheme, using new loans to pay the minimum balances on old loans, and now he had run out of creditors who would trust him on his signature alone. He needed my pristine credit to secure his next round of fake wealth. I scrolled deeper into the search results. My eyes scanned the Uniform Commercial Code filings. These were public notices filed by creditors to announce their legal claim to a debtor assets. I noticed a pending filing submitted just 2 weeks ago by a predatory mezzanine lender. I clicked on the attached collateral document. My breath hitched in my throat. The quiet hum of my office faded away. Greg was attempting to secure a massive line of credit. To satisfy the underwriters, he had pledged a piece of domestic real estate as physical collateral. I read the listed address line by line. It was the Wayzata Lakeside Cabin. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. My heart pounded a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. Greg had listed my property as the backing for his failing business debts. He assumed Richard actually owned the equity in the home. He assumed the house was free and clear, ready to be plundered. But my blind trust Apex Holdings owned the debt. I held the primary lien. Greg, attempting to leverage a property he did not own, was textbook bank fraud. But Greg could not pledge the property without proof of ownership. The underwriters would have demanded title documents and signed authorizations from the recorded owner. A chilling realization washed over me. Greg could not have submitted that application alone. Someone had to provide him with the property deeds. Someone had to sign the collateral authorization forms under the penalty of perjury. Someone like my father. My father did not just come to my apartment at midnight because he was embarrassed about missing a payment. He was in a blind panic because the default notice proved he did not control the asset he had just illegally promised to another bank. I reached for my coffee mug. The ceramic was cold. The golden facade of my family had not just cracked, it had shattered, exposing a federal crime. I looked at the glowing screen, ready to trace the forged signatures that would seal their fate. The glow of the monitors cast a pale blue light across my home office. I stared at the digital collateral document. Greg had listed the Wayzata Cabin as the backing for his failing business loan. But a corporate underwriter does not just take a borrower at their word. They demand proof. They require a paper trail. As a dual-credentialed attorney and forensic accountant, I knew the exact anatomy of a commercial real estate transaction. A secondary lender would mandate a signed affidavit of title. They would need the recorded owner to legally pledge the equity. I needed to see the signature page. I accessed the county clerk digital repository. I paid the nominal statutory fee to pull the raw, unredacted filings associated with the parcel identification number of the cabin. The system took a few moments to process the request. The loading icon spun on my screen. My hands rested on the cool metal of my desk. I expected to find a clumsy forgery. I expected to see Greg attempting to mimic my father's handwriting. I assumed my brother-in-law was a rogue actor desperate enough to commit identity theft to save his sinking tech investments. The portable document format file loaded. I scrolled past the boilerplate indemnification clauses and the interest rate disclosures. I reached the final page containing the guarantor authorization section. I stopped breathing. The silence in my apartment grew heavy. There were 2 signatures inked at the bottom of the page in blue pen. They were not forgeries. I had seen these signatures on birthday cards and high school permission slips and college tuition checks my entire life. Richard Paul signed his name with the familiar sharp looping cursive he used for his import business contracts. Susan Paul signed right below him, her handwriting neat and upright. Beside their names sat the official stamp of a local notary public. This was the quiet revelation that dropped into the still water of my reality. My parents were not victims of a rogue son-in-law. They were active, willing co-conspirators. The emotional weight of those ink strokes hit me harder than the harsh Minnesota winter outside. They had willingly walked into a notary office, raised their right hands, and swore under the penalty of perjury that they owned the property free and clear. They had pledged phantom equity they did not possess. They had signed away a house that legally belonged to my blind trust. Why would they take such an insane legal risk? The answer lay in the twisted, prestige-obsessed culture of our family. My parents worshipped status. They treated my brother David like royalty because his neurosurgery fellowship at the Mayo Clinic provided them with endless bragging rights at dinner parties. They needed Vanessa to represent the other half of their perfect equation. Vanessa had to remain the flawless Wayzata housewife married to the brilliant tech investor. Admitting that Greg was bankrupt would mean admitting their golden family was a failure. They could not tolerate the shame of a failed marriage or a repossessed luxury vehicle. They viewed my elite legal and accounting credentials as a threat rather than an asset. They tolerated my existence only when I stayed quiet in the background. But when Vanessa Lifestyle began to collapse, they did not come to me for legal advice. They decided to commit federal wire and bank fraud to prop her up. I leaned closer to the monitor, analyzing the dates on the notarized documents. The brutal realization crashed down on me. The dates aligned perfectly with a sudden, subtle shift in my parents' behavior last month. To secure a secondary bridge loan, the mezzanine lender would have required an updated physical appraisal of the cabin. An inspector would have visited the property to assess the structural value. My parents had to coordinate this. They had to let a stranger walk through the house, taking photographs of the stone fireplace and the lakeside deck to verify the collateral for Greg. They assumed Apex Holdings was just a faceless corporate machine holding their primary mortgage. They assumed a nameless restructuring firm would never notice a secondary lien filed in a local county courthouse. They thought they had found a loophole to steal the equity they believed they still owned. And then I understood the Thanksgiving text message. You always ask those tense work questions. The disinvitation was not about protecting David from stress. It was not about wanting a peaceful holiday. It was calculated, frantic risk management. My parents knew my profession. They knew I spent my days hunting hidden assets and unmasking corporate shell games. They were terrified of my analytical eye. If I sat at the Thanksgiving table, I would notice the subtle signs of financial panic. I might notice a stray piece of mail from the secondary lender. I might ask the wrong question about Greg's new venture. I might casually inquire about why the county tax assessor website showed a recent property valuation update. They banned me from the holiday because they were committing a felony on a house they thought they got away with stealing, and they knew I was the only person capable of catching them. I was not exiled for being a drama starter. I was exiled because I was a human lie detector, and they were harboring a severe secret. A deep, cold anger settled into my chest. It was not a fiery rage. It was the precise, chilling fury of an auditor who had just balanced a corrupt ledger. They were willing to risk federal prison to maintain a suburban illusion. They were willing to throw me away to protect the son-in-law who was dragging them into ruin. I downloaded the raw affidavit forms and saved them to an encrypted external drive. I printed hard copies on my laser printer. The sheets of paper felt warm and heavy in my hands. This was not just family dysfunction anymore. This was a documented crime. The signatures of my mother and father were clear as day, binding them to a fraudulent contract. I thought about my mother. Susan Paul was the architect of the Thanksgiving exile. She was the one who hearted the text message, prioritizing a polite facade over her own daughter. She likely believed she could control the fallout. She always thought she could smooth over any unpleasantness with a tight smile and a fresh pot of coffee. I needed to look her in the eye. I needed to see how far she was willing to take this charade. I picked up my phone and drafted a short text message to her. I typed, I think we need to talk in person. Tomorrow morning, the coffee shop on Main Street. Just us. I hit send. I knew she would agree. She would view the invitation as an opportunity to manage me. She would think she could offer a meager olive branch and convince me to stay quiet and compliant. She had no idea that the silent corporate entity she tried to defraud was sitting in this very room, holding her forged signatures. The bank default notice was already ticking toward foreclosure. Now I had the criminal evidence to ensure their golden facade would shatter entirely. I gathered the printed documents and placed them into a thick black leather auditing binder. Tomorrow, I would let my mother attempt to play her games, and then I would show her the receipts. The morning sun barely pierced the thick gray cloud cover hanging over Minneapolis. I sat in a corner booth at a bustling local coffee shop on Main Street. The air inside smelled of roasted espresso beans and melted butter from fresh pastries. The hiss of the commercial espresso machine provided a steady rhythm masking the low hum of morning conversations. The warmth of the cafe stood in sharp contrast to the biting winter wind howling outside the frosted windows. I chose this public setting with strategic intent. In our family, a public venue meant the Minnesota Nice Protocol had to remain in full effect. My mother could not raise her voice or throw a tantrum with a local audience present. She was a prisoner to her own curated image. I rested my hands on the black leather auditing binder sitting flat on the wooden table. Inside those covers lay the printed affidavits bearing the forged signatures of my parents. I waited to see which version of my mother would walk through the door. Susan Paul arrived 12 minutes late. She pushed through the heavy glass doors, bringing a gust of frigid air with her. She wore a pristine camel-colored cashmere coat and a silk scarf tied perfectly at her neck. Her blonde hair, sprayed into an immovable helmet, caught the ambient lighting. She smiled brightly at the barista, offering a cheerful wave to an acquaintance sitting near the pastry display. My mother treated every public outing like a campaign stop for a mayoral race she was desperate to win. She spent her entire adult life navigating country club politics, prioritizing optics over genuine connection. Her daughters were merely extensions of her social standing. Vanessa provided the picturesque lifestyle. I provided an inconvenient reality check. She spotted me in the corner booth. Her bright smile tightened into a rigid line for a fraction of a second before returning to a practiced mask of maternal warmth. She walked over, her expensive leather boots clicking against the polished concrete floor. She slid into the booth opposite me. She did not take off her coat. She sat perched on the edge of the seat, as if this meeting was a minor inconvenience in her busy schedule. "Good morning, Alethea," she said, her tone light and breezy. "I already ordered a vanilla latte at the counter. So, what did you want to discuss?" "I have a charity luncheon at noon, and I need to review the floral arrangements with Vanessa." She looked at me, waiting for me to break. She expected me to apologize for upsetting my father the previous night. She expected me to fold. For 31 years, she had trained me to smooth over the rough edges of our family dynamics. I studied her face. I looked for any sign of remorse or guilt regarding the federal bank fraud she committed to secure a loan for her son-in-law. There was nothing. She was entirely serene, sustained by the delusion that she was untouchable. "I brought the documents you and Dad signed," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "The collateral authorizations for Greg, the ones where you pledged a house you do not own to a secondary lender." Her manicured fingers twitched on the table. The barista arrived, placing her steaming latte in front of her. Susan offered the young woman a glowing smile, thanking her profusely. The moment the barista stepped away, the warmth vanished from my mother's eyes. She reached into her oversized designer handbag. Instead of offering an explanation or a tearful apology, she pulled out a thick manila envelope. She placed it on the table between us. Her hand rested on top of the paper, pressing it down. "Dad told me about the misunderstanding with the property registry," she whispered, leaning forward so the neighboring tables could not hear. You have always been so rigid, Alethea, so focused on the technicalities. We are family. We help each other. Greg is on the verge of a major breakthrough, and he just needed a little leverage to satisfy the underwriters. She slid the manila envelope across the wooden surface until it touched the edge of my binder. "Open it," she instructed. I lifted the flap and pulled out a small stack of stapled papers. A quick glance at the header revealed the nature of the document. It was a non-disclosure agreement coupled with a formal demand letter. The letterhead belonged to a cheap strip mall attorney, the kind of lawyer who handled traffic tickets and rapid divorces. I scanned the text. The document demanded that I immediately transfer all managing rights of Apex Holdings to Greg. It also contained a sweeping gag order requiring me to remain permanently silent about the financial origins of the Wyzetta cabin. In exchange, they would graciously allow me to attend family holidays, and they promised to eventually pay me back when Greg secured his mythical tech funding. I looked up from the papers. The sheer audacity was staggering. "Just sign it, Alethea," my mother pleaded, her voice dropping into a venomous, frantic whisper. "Let Greg manage the property. He knows what he is doing. We can put this ugly business behind us and have a beautiful Thanksgiving. Do not be the reason this family falls apart. It is the Christian thing to do." The Christian thing to do. The phrase hung in the air, dripping with weaponized guilt. She was attempting to use moral superiority to extort a multi-million-dollar asset. She expected the old version of me to surface, the quiet daughter who absorbed the blame to keep the peace. But I was not that girl anymore. I was a lead forensic financial auditor. I dismantled corporate embezzlement rings for a living. I did not fold under pressure. I followed the paper trail. I reached into my blazer pocket. I pulled out my favorite red auditing pen. I clicked the top. The sharp sound severed the tension in the booth. Susan blinked her perfect smile, faltering. "What are you doing?" I placed the tip of the red pen onto the first page of the legal document. I started writing. "This non-disclosure agreement is unenforceable," I stated calmly, drawing a thick red line through the entire first paragraph. "Your attorney cited a corporate governance statute that was repealed in Minnesota 3 years ago. Furthermore, a contract attempting to conceal an active federal crime is void under the doctrine of illegality." I flipped to the second page. My red pen slashed through the asset transfer clauses. "You cannot demand the transfer of a blind trust without a designated fiduciary review." I continued, my voice steady and clinical. "And this indemnification clause is drafted so poorly that if I signed it, I would actually be granting myself the right to sue Greg for his outstanding credit card debt." I finished marking the pages, leaving a sea of red ink over the cheap legal jargon. I slid the corrected document back across the table. It came to rest against her pristine coffee cup. Susan stared at the red lines. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The illusion of her control was evaporating in real time. "I am not signing your extortion papers, Mom," I said, looking directly into her wide eyes. "I am not transferring the LLC, and I am certainly not protecting Greg." She gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles turned white. "You are destroying your own family, Alethea. You are acting out of spite because David and Vanessa are successful and you are alone. If you do not sign this, we will have no choice but to take legal action against your trust." I closed my pen and slipped it back into my pocket. The threat was empty, and we both knew it. "You cannot afford a lawyer to fight me," I replied. "You cannot even afford the property taxes on the cabin." I picked up my black binder and stood up from the booth. I looked down at my mother. The cashmere coat and the silk scarf suddenly looked like a costume on a very tired actor. "I did not come here to negotiate a truce," I told her. "I came here to give you a timeline." Her eyes darted around the cafe, paranoid that someone was watching our exchange. "What timeline?" she hissed. "The primary mortgage on the Wyzetta cabin is officially in default," I declared, ensuring my enunciation was perfectly clear. The 14-day grace period expired this morning at 8 o'clock. I instructed the bank to accelerate the debt collection. Susan, face drained of color, the polite mask shattered, leaving only stark, primal terror. "You cannot do that," she stammered. "The neighbors, the country club, where will we go?" I did not answer her. I turned my back on her and walked toward the exit. The heavy glass doors parted, and the freezing winter wind hit my face, clearing my head. I knew my mother would not surrender gracefully. She and Vanessa would retreat to their affluent suburban enclave and mobilize their most lethal weapon. They would spin a narrative painting me as the villain to preserve their fragile pride. The Wyzetta Whisper Network was about to activate. But I was already preparing my next legal strike. The retaliation began exactly 24 hours after I walked out of the Main Street Cafe, leaving my mother staring at a ruined extortion attempt. In the affluent enclave surrounding Minneapolis, physical altercations are considered unsophisticated. High society matrons do not shout in public squares. They weaponize concern. They orchestrate whisper networks designed to slowly suffocate their targets under a thick blanket of manufactured sympathy. My older sister Vanessa was a renowned maestro of this particular psychological symphony. I sat at my desk inside the downtown audit firm, reviewing a dense corporate tax file, when my personal cellular device began to vibrate against the polished mahogany surface. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from my Aunt Barbara. Barbara was a woman who spent her entire existence organizing charity galas and trading hushed rumors over afternoon tennis matches. I had not spoken to her since last Christmas, yet her words dripped with a cloying, invasive familiarity. The message read, "Oh my goodness, Alethea, I am praying for your mental health. Susan told me you are having a breakdown and lashing out at your father. Let me know if you need a small loan. I heard they cut you financially. Stay strong, sweetie. We are all rooting for your recovery." I stared at the glowing pixels. The tactical brilliance of the lie was undeniable. Vanessa and my mother knew they could not hide the impending bank default forever. Their solution was to preemptively control the narrative before the truth leaked into their pristine social circle. By painting me as an unstable, jealous sibling who had been severed from the family fortune, they inoculated themselves against the eventual fallout. When the eviction happened, they would simply tell the country club that a deranged, estranged daughter had filed fraudulent paperwork to steal their home out of spite. Another notification chimed, breaking the silence of my corner office. This time, the sender was a former high school acquaintance I barely kept in touch with. Her message mirrored the exact phrasing. "So sorry to hear about your recent struggles, Alethea. We hope you find peace soon." They were laying the groundwork for a thorough social assassination. Vanessa was curating an image of the perfect Wyzetta family, bravely enduring the tragic unraveling of a troubled relative. It was a flawless defense mechanism, crafted in the manicured cul-de-sacs of our youth. Growing up, any independent thought I expressed was treated as a symptom of emotional instability. When I chose to pursue dual credentials instead of hunting for a wealthy husband at the local yacht club, my parents acted as if I had contracted a terminal illness. Now they were utilizing that old familiar script to discredit my audit. I did not block the incoming numbers. I did not reply to defend myself. An investigator understands that defensive statements only validate the interrogator. Instead, I logged every single message documenting the spread of the defamation. Let them whisper. Let them gather fake sympathy. It would only make the impending collision with reality much more devastating. My corner office provided a sanctuary of logic amidst their chaotic emotional warfare. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a sweeping view of the frozen city below. The environment here operated on verifiable data, not country club rumors. I turned my attention back to the spreadsheet on my primary monitor, analyzing a series of offshore holding accounts for a client. A soft knock on the open door frame interrupted my focus. The firm receptionist stepped into the room holding a thick certified envelope bearing a premium tracking label. She handed the parcel to me, mentioning it required a direct signature for the courier log. I signed the electronic pad and inspected the package. The return address belonged to the same cheap strip mall legal practice my mother had utilized for the botched non-disclosure agreement. This time, however, the sender listed on the top line was my brother-in-law, Greg. I reached into my desk drawer and retrieved a silver letter opener. I sliced through the heavy paper, pulling out a stack of documents bound by a black plastic clip. The header, printed in a bold, arrogant font, announced a formal cease and desist order. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, reading the text. My mind processed the paragraphs, expecting another transactional extortion attempt. What I found instead was a display of legal delusions so profound it bordered on pure comedy. Greg was attempting to claim adverse possession of the lakeside property. The drafted argument stated that because my father, Richard, had occupied the residence for 4 years while paying a monthly rent to the corporate entity, he had established a squatter right to the equity. The document demanded that Apex Holdings halt all eviction proceedings immediately and surrender the deed to the current occupants. I read the lines a second time to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. Adverse possession is a legitimate legal concept, colloquially known as squatter rights. But the statutory requirements in the state of Minnesota demand hostile, open, and notorious occupation without the permission of the owner for a continuous, uninterrupted period of 15 years. My father had occupied the home for only 4 years under my explicit financial grace period. He was not a hostile squatter. He was a defaulting borrower whose bills I had been quietly paying through a blind trust. Greg was arguing that the very financial rescue I provided was actually a rental agreement transferring ownership back to my parents. It was a paper sword swung by a drowning man. He was trying to halt the foreclosure using a legal theory that would get a first-year law student laughed out of a municipal courtroom. The sheer absurdity of the document crystallized their dire situation. They were entirely out of options. They could not secure the fraudulent bridge loan because the primary mortgage was now in active default. They could not pay the arrears because Greg was bankrupt and my father was running a failing import business. All they had left were neighborhood rumors and legally illiterate threat letters. They assumed my law degree was just a decorative piece of paper. They thought they could intimidate me with a certified letter sent by a strip mall attorney. I placed the cease and desist order into the thick black leather auditing binder resting on the edge of my desk. I set it right next to the printed affidavits containing the forged collateral authorizations. Every desperate move they made only provided me with more actionable evidence. They were fighting for their suburban survival using gossip and fake legal threats, while I held the immutable keys to their destruction. A quiet calm washed over me. I looked at the digital calendar on my secondary monitor. Tomorrow was Wednesday, Thanksgiving Eve, the day my parents traditionally hosted a lavish, catered preparation party for their most influential neighbors. They would be pouring expensive imported wine and projecting unyielding prosperity while standing on a trap door. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my retained corporate counsel. The attorney answered on the second ring. I instructed him to draft the formal notice of default and foreclosure intent. I told him to trigger the acceleration clause due to the secondary lien fraud attempt. And then I gave him a very specific directive regarding the delivery of those legal documents. I wanted the local county sheriff's civil division to serve the physical, unsealable court orders directly to the cabin. The gears of retribution were now locked into place, and the cold winter reality was about to crash through their front door. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving brought an early dusk to the city of Minneapolis. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a bruised purple sky and a biting wind that rattled the exterior glass of my downtown office building. Most of the corporate staff had evacuated the floors hours ago, eager to begin their long holiday weekend. The corridors were silent. The ambient lighting remained dimmed to a low hum. I sat alone in my corner suite, surrounded by the glow of 3 high-resolution monitors and the stark reality of immutable data. I held my cellular device in my right hand. My thumb rested on the screen, tapping through a sequence of public social media stories broadcasted by my older sister. Vanessa was an expert at curating an enviable digital existence. Tonight, she was documenting the annual Thanksgiving Eve preparation party hosted at the Wayzata Lakeside Cabin. The first video displayed a fleet of luxury sport utility vehicles parked along the snow-covered driveway. A professional catering van idled near the garage, its side panel advertising a premium local culinary service. The next video transitioned to the interior of the house. The pristine stone fireplace roared with perfectly stacked birch logs. Crystal wine glasses caught the light of the imported chandelier. My mother, Susan, floated through the frame, wearing a tailored emerald dress, holding court among a group of affluent neighbors. She pointed to a towering floral centerpiece, laughing with a practiced, airy grace. My father, Richard, stood near the kitchen island, uncorking a bottle of vintage red wine. He poured generous measures for the local country club president and a prominent regional judge. They were projecting an aura of unyielding prosperity. They were selling the illusion of a family steeped in generational wealth and elite status. I tapped the screen again. The camera panned to the grand entryway. The heavy oak door swung open to reveal my brother David arriving from his shift at the hospital. He still wore his medical scrubs beneath a designer wool coat. The entire room seemed to pause and collectively exhale a breath of sheer reverence. Susan rushed forward to take his coat. Richard beamed with unadulterated pride, clapping a heavy hand on David's shoulder. They treated the young neurosurgery fellow as if he had just descended from a celestial realm. The medical prestige he carried was the ultimate currency in their social circles. The final video in the sequence brought a sharp, metallic taste to the back of my mouth. Vanessa had positioned her camera to capture her husband standing by the hearth. Greg held a crystal tumbler filled with amber scotch. He was surrounded by a small captive audience of local business owners. His voice carried over the ambient jazz music playing in the background. "We are just finalizing a new real estate acquisition," Greg boasted, swirling the liquid in his glass. "A prime lakeside asset. The market is shifting, but when you know how to leverage the right capital, the opportunities are endless. You just have to be willing to make the aggressive play." Vanessa added a digital sticker to the corner of the video. It read, "So proud of my visionary husband." I lowered the phone and placed it face down on the mahogany desk. The contrast between their digital arrogance and their actual financial ruin was a staggering psychological study. My brother-in-law was a bankrupt fraudster drowning in civil judgments. My parents were delinquent borrowers who had just committed a federal felony by forging signatures to pledge a house they did not own. Yet, there they stood, in a warm, brilliantly lit room, drinking expensive wine and soaking in the admiration of their peers. They were dancing on a trap door, and I held the lever. I turned my attention away from the fictional universe of social media and focused on the center monitor on my desk. The screen displayed the original commercial lending agreement drafted between my blind trust Apex Holdings and my father. As a dual-credentialed attorney and forensic accountant, I did not rely on standard boilerplate contracts when dealing with high-risk assets. I had structured the mortgage with airtight precision. In a standard real estate default, the foreclosure process in Minnesota can be a prolonged, grueling affair. A borrower typically receives multiple cure notices, and the eviction timeline can drag out for months. My parents were likely counting on that standard bureaucratic delay. If they even realized the default notice was real, they probably assumed they could stretch the dispute through the winter, keeping up appearances until the spring thaw. They failed to understand the specific legal triggers embedded within the corporate contract they signed 4 years ago. I scrolled down to Section 8 of the lending agreement. The header outlined the terms for a debt acceleration clause. An acceleration clause allows a lender to call the entire principal balance of the loan due immediately if the borrower violates a fundamental covenant of the trust. A missed payment triggers a simple default, but attempting to encumber the property with a secondary fraudulent lien triggers an irrevocable breach of contract. Because Richard and Susan had signed those forged affidavits for Greg, attempting to leverage the cabin to a mezzanine lender, they had activated the most brutal legal mechanism at my disposal. I did not have to wait for months of missed payments. I did not have to endure a lengthy arbitration process. The entire balance of the Wyzetta property was now due in full. I opened my encrypted email client and drafted a new message to my retained corporate counsel. The attorney was a sharp, pragmatic litigator who specialized in rapid asset recovery. He knew the parameters of the Apex Holdings portfolio. I typed out the directives with clinical efficiency. I instructed him to file the formal notice of default and foreclosure intent with the county clerk first thing in the morning. I attached the digital copies of the forged secondary lien affidavits I had harvested from the public registry. I directed him to cite the specific acceleration clause invoking the immediate demand for the full principal balance. Then I reached the most critical element of the legal strike, the delivery mechanism. In civil proceedings, a notice of foreclosure intent must be formally served to the occupants of the residence. A standard courier or a certified mail carrier is often sufficient for routine matters. However, a recipient can refuse to sign for a package. They can dodge a private process server by ignoring the doorbell or hiding behind their gated driveway. I required a method of delivery that could not be ignored, denied, or swept under the rug. I typed a final paragraph into the email. I requested that my counsel contract the local county sheriff's civil division to execute the physical service of the court documents. Uniformed deputies possess the legal authority to walk up to any door and demand the identification of the occupants. Their presence is undeniable. Their authority is absolute. I looked at the clock on my computer screen. I calculated the logistical timeline required for the county dispatcher to process the paperwork and assign a patrol unit. I added one last sentence to the message. Instruct the civil division to serve the documents at the property address tomorrow afternoon precisely at 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock on Thanksgiving Day, the exact hour my mother traditionally instructed her guests to take their seats in the formal dining room. The exact moment Richard would stand at the head of the long mahogany table, raising a glass to offer a toast to his own fictional success. The exact time the driveway would be packed with the luxury vehicles of their most influential peers. I hit the send button. The email vanished from my outbox, initiating an unstoppable sequence of legal events. The trap was fully set. I closed my laptop and packed it into my leather briefcase. I stood up and walked over to the glass wall of my office, gazing out at the frozen Mississippi River. The streetlights flickered against the driving snow, creating a swirling vortex of white flakes over the empty asphalt. The temperature was projected to drop another 10 degrees by tomorrow evening. My family had sent a text message exiling me from their holiday table because they feared my analytical questions would ruin their aesthetic. They had orchestrated a whisper campaign among their socialite friends, hoping to paint me as an unstable villain. They had tried to extort me with a laughable non-disclosure agreement to protect a bankrupt son-in-law. They thought they had won. They thought the Thanksgiving holiday would provide them with a warm, secure sanctuary surrounded by the admiration of their community. I turned off the office lights. The darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the faint illumination from the city skyline. Tomorrow, I would drive out to the Wyzetta cabin. I would not bring a side dish or a bottle of wine. I would bring a black leather auditing binder filled with the raw, unfiltered truth. And I would sit quietly, waiting for the heavy, authoritative knock on the front door to shatter their golden illusion into a million unrecoverable pieces. The digital dashboard clock in my practical all-wheel drive sedan read 3:45 in the afternoon. The sky above the interstate had turned a flat, bruised gray, a desolate color unique to a Minnesota winter. The temperature hovered in the single digits, freezing the edges of the lake into a solid sheet of white ice. I turned off the main highway and navigated the winding tree-lined roads of the Wayzata enclave. The heater in my vehicle hummed a steady low note. I felt a profound clinical calm settling into my bones. As a lead forensic financial auditor, I spent my career walking into hostile boardrooms and dismantling corporate embezzlement rings. I was trained to confront cornered executives and unmask carefully hidden liabilities. A suburban Thanksgiving dinner was simply another audit. The emotional manipulation that once controlled me had evaporated, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the ledger. The lakeside cabin came into view through the bare branches of the oak trees. The property was a sprawling exhibition of imported engineering. Black sport utility vehicles with tinted windows lined the pristine concrete. Silver sedans bearing luxury emblems crowded the edges of the manicured lawn. My parents had invited the elite tier of their social circle. Greg parked his leased white Range Rover near the top of the incline, occupying the prime space near the front stone walkway. The vehicle was a perfect metaphor for his existence, shiny, expensive, and entirely owned by a bank. I did not search for polite street parking. I pulled my sedan directly behind his rear bumper, shifting the transmission into park. I killed the engine. He was boxed in. An investigator always secures the perimeter before initiating a confrontation, ensuring the targets cannot initiate a rapid retreat. I stepped out into the frigid air. The crunch of my boots on the frozen gravel was the only sound breaking the winter stillness. The cabin glowed with warm amber light spilling through the frost-edged window panes. Faint notes of a jazz saxophone drifted through the thick timber walls. I walked up the stone steps to the heavy oak entrance. I did not pause to knock. I turned the cold brass handle and pushed the door wide open. The sensory impact hit me instantly. The air inside felt heavy, thick with the scent of roasted turkey sage butter, expensive cedar firewood, and a cloying mixture of designer perfumes. The foyer was bustling with affluent bodies. Guests mingled in small, intimate clusters, holding delicate crystal flutes filled with premium champagne. The sound of their polite laughter echoed off the vaulted timber ceiling. My brother David stood near the grand staircase, wearing a bespoke, tailored suit, receiving the quiet adoration of a local hospital administrator. The entire room functioned as a monument to my parents' manufactured success. A woman standing near the mahogany coat closet noticed me first. Her conversation halted mid-sentence. Her gaze dropped to my dark tailored blazer and the thick black leather binder clutched securely in my left hand. The silence spread like a drop of dark ink in a glass of clear water. It moved through the room, infecting one group of guests after another. The laughter faded into confused murmurs. The low hum of networking ceased. The clinking of fine crystal stopped entirely. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward the entryway, taking in the sight of the uninvited daughter. My mother materialized from the kitchen corridor. She wore the tailored emerald dress I had seen in the digital videos. Her face performed a miraculous feat of muscular control. Her eyes were wide with genuine terror, tracking the abrupt silence of her influential guests, but her lips stretched into a rigid, blinding smile designed for public consumption. She rushed across the hardwood floor, her heels clicking a frantic, irregular rhythm. Susan Paul operated on the principle of strict containment. Throughout my childhood, any display of genuine emotion or independent thought was swiftly redirected to a private space to preserve the suburban illusion. She treated my arrival like a spilled glass of red wine on a white carpet. It needed to be scrubbed and hidden before a stain could set. "Alethea, sweetie," she chirped. The volume of her voice was too loud, a desperate attempt to signal normalcy to the watching crowd. She grabbed my elbow. Her manicured fingers dug into the wool of my sleeve, attempting to steer my momentum. "What a surprise. We were not expecting you to drop by. Let us just step into the utility room for a quick second to hang up your coat out of the way." She tried to pull me toward the narrow hallway housing the washer and dryer. She wanted to shove the inconvenient truth behind a closed door next to the bleach and the fabric softener. "You cannot be here," she whispered, her cheerful tone dropping into a frantic, venomous hiss the moment we stepped out of the direct eye line of the guests. "We have investors in the living room. David brought his chief of surgery. You are ruining the aesthetic." I did not reply. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. "I can fix you a plate," she offered, her voice trembling with barely suppressed panic. "I will put some white meat and stuffing in a nice container. You can take it home to your apartment. Just leave quietly. Do not cause a scene tonight, Alethea. Be reasonable. Let Greg handle his business." I did not pull my arm away. I simply stopped walking. My mother lacked the physical leverage to move an adult who refused to yield. The resistance forced her to stop. She let go of my sleeve as if the fabric burned her skin. I bypassed the utility corridor, ignoring her frantic whispers. I walked directly toward the heart of the cabin, leaving her standing in the hallway. The formal dining area was a testament to excessive curation. An immense mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, meticulously set for 20 guests. Silver flatware gleamed under the light of the imported glass chandelier. Crisp linen napkins sat folded into intricate peaks, resting on fine bone china. Handwritten place cards dictated the social hierarchy of the evening. My father stood near the patio doors, chatting with a regional judge holding a glass of vintage red wine. Greg held court near the stone fireplace, wearing his tailored fleece vest, projecting the image of a tech visionary to anyone who would listen. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. The remaining guests parted, creating a narrow path for me to walk through. Richard noticed the shift in the room dynamics. He turned away from the judge. His confident smile vanished, replaced by a dark, rigid panic. Greg stopped talking mid-sentence. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered as he recognized the heavy black binder in my hand. I walked straight to the head of the immense mahogany table. It was the seat traditionally reserved for the patriarch of the family. The seat where my father planned to stand, raise his glass, and offer a toast to his own fictional success. I pulled the heavy wooden chair back and sat down. The leather cushions sighed under my weight. I placed the thick auditing binder onto the pristine white linen tablecloth, setting it directly next to a steaming porcelain gravy boat. The dull thud of the binder echoed in the silent room. I looked around the table, meeting the bewildered stares of the local business owners, the supposed investors, and my terrified parents. I offered them a perfectly polite Minnesota smile. I brought the receipts, I said. The migration from the foyer to the formal dining room resembled a slow marching funeral procession rather than a festive holiday gathering. My mother attempted to salvage the atmosphere, herding the influential neighbors and local business owners toward their designated seats. She offered frantic, high-pitched assurances that everything was perfectly fine, relying on the deeply ingrained suburban code that demanded guests ignore any blatant discomfort. The hired catering staff emerged from the kitchen, carrying heavy silver platters. They placed roasted root vegetables, artisan breads, and a sprawling golden turkey onto the center of the immense mahogany table. The aroma of sage butter and rosemary filled the room, contrasting sharply with the cold, suffocating dread radiating from my parents. I remained seated at the head of the table. Richard had no choice but to take a chair near the middle, relinquishing his traditional position of patriarchal authority. He could not physically remove me without causing a physical altercation in front of the regional judge and the hospital administrator. He sat stiffly, his face locked in a pale, rigid grimace. The guests settled into their chairs. The clinking of silver forks against fine bone china sounded nervous and erratic. Nobody knew exactly how to navigate the sudden shift in the social hierarchy. David sat near the far end, looking bewildered. His prestigious medical fellowship offered him no diagnostic tools for the financial autopsy I was about to perform. Greg sat directly to my left. Next to him was an older, silver-haired gentleman wearing a bespoke tailored suit. This was the primary investor Greg had been boasting to by the fireplace, the man who supposedly provided the capital for my brother-in-law and his visionary tech acquisitions. The tension in the room grew heavy, pressing down on the affluent attendees. Greg realized the silence was drowning his curated image. He needed to reclaim the narrative before the whispers could begin. He reached for his crystal goblet filled with vintage red wine. He stood up, pushing his chair back against the hardwood floor. A bead of perspiration traced a path down his temple. The heat of the roaring stone fireplace did not account for the moisture on his skin. He gripped the stem of the glass, his knuckles turning a faint shade of white. "If I could have everyone's attention for a brief moment," Greg announced, projecting his voice across the long room. He painted a confident smirk across his face, relying on the arrogant charm that usually seduced unsuspecting creditors. The guests politely ceased their quiet murmurs. They turned their attention toward him, eager for a distraction from the agonizing awkwardness of my silent presence. "Thanksgiving is a time to reflect on our blessings," Greg continued, raising his glass higher. "We are surrounded by incredible friends and a community that values hard work. We celebrate family, self-made success, and the courage to own your future. When you take the aggressive path in life, you create your own legacy. Here is to building empires and honoring the people who support our visions." A few polite nods rippled through the seated audience. Several guests reached for their wine glasses, preparing to return the toast. I placed my hand flat on top of the black leather auditing binder resting next to the steaming gravy boat. The dull sound of my palm striking the thick cover echoed down the length of the table. "Before we drink to your self-made success, Greg, I think your primary investor should understand exactly what kind of empire you are building," I said. My voice was calm, carrying the even clinical tone of a forensic examiner delivering a final audit report. I flipped the heavy cover open. The crisp white pages inside lay perfectly ordered. I bypassed the initial stack of property deeds and retrieved a single document from the secondary folder. It was a formal public filing, harvested directly from the federal court database. I had redacted his personal identification number, but left the financial summaries starkly visible. I placed the paper onto the polished mahogany surface. I pressed my fingertips against the edge and slid it down the table. The friction of the heavy stock paper gliding over the wood created a sharp, rushing sound. The document slid directly past Greg, coming to a smooth halt precisely in front of the silver-haired investor. The older man lowered his wine glass. He looked down at the paper. The bold federal seal printed at the top center of the page commanded immediate attention. He retrieved a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and slid them onto his face. His eyes scanned the header. It was a Chapter 7 federal bankruptcy petition, filed mere weeks ago. It listed a staggering sequence of defaulted loans, unpaid independent contractors, and hollow shell companies holding zero tangible assets. Greg froze. The arrogant smirk shattered, dissolving into raw, unadulterated panic. He stared at the piece of paper sitting in front of his crucial networking target. Vanessa reacted with the speed of a cornered animal. She leaned across the table, her emerald necklace catching the light of the chandelier. She let out a high-pitched, breathless laugh. The sound was frantic, sharp, and entirely devoid of genuine mirth. "Oh my goodness," she chirped, waving her hand in the air. "Alethea has such a weird, dramatic sense of humor. You really cannot take her seriously." She printed out some joke forms from the internet. She works in accounting and thinks these little pranks are hilarious. Please just ignore her. Her attempt to wave away a federal court record using suburban etiquette was a fascinating display of delusion. The investor did not laugh. He did not look at Vanessa. He kept his eyes locked on the itemized list of Greg's outstanding civil judgments. He recognized authentic legal filings. I ignored my sister entirely. I kept my gaze fixed on Greg and my father. "If this is a joke," I continued, keeping my posture relaxed against the leather chair, "then the secondary bridge loan you applied for last week is the punchline." I reached back into the binder. I pulled out the stapled collateral authorization affidavits. These were the notarized forms required by the mezzanine lender to secure the cash advance Greg desperately needed to maintain his charade. I passed the stack of papers down the line. They landed near the center of the table, right where the regional judge and the hospital administrator were seated. "Those are the equity pledge forms Greg submitted to the underwriters," I explained, my voice cutting through the thick silence of the room. He attempted to leverage this very cabin as physical collateral for his failing business debt. The problem is, Greg does not own this property. Neither does my father. My blind trust holds the primary deed, and I have controlled the debt for 4 years. Richard closed his eyes. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles trembled under his skin. "To pledge an asset you do not own, you must provide proof of ownership," I stated, detailing the mechanics of the transaction to the horrified audience. Greg could not do that alone. He needed the recorded occupants to swear under penalty of perjury that they held the equity free and clear. If you look at the final page of those affidavits, you will see 2 signatures executed in blue ink, Richard and Susan Paul. The regional judge leaned forward, peering at the notarized signature page. His judicial training instantly recognized the gravity of the ink strokes on the paper. Pledging phantom equity to a financial institution using fraudulent signatures is not a family misunderstanding, I told the silent room. It is a textbook violation of federal statutes. Specifically, it constitutes bank fraud and wire fraud. I looked directly at my father, watching the patriarchal authority drain out of his posture, leaving behind a hollow, broken shell. Under the federal code, executing a scheme to defraud a financial institution carries a maximum penalty of 30 years in federal prison, I stated, laying out the cold, hard mathematics of their choices. When you transmitted those forged documents across state lines to the underwriters, you triggered the wire fraud statutes, adding another potential 20 years to the sentencing guidelines. The air in the formal dining room grew stagnant. The affluent guests realized they were not attending a simple holiday dinner. They were sitting in the epicenter of an active crime scene. The proximity to federal felonies is a highly contagious disease in wealthy circles. Nobody wanted their name associated with a federal investigation. The silver-haired investor carefully removed his reading glasses. He placed them back into his pocket. He did not say a word to Greg. He simply set his crystal wine glass onto the table and pushed his chair back. Across the room, the hospital administrator slowly lowered his silver fork. The crisp sound of the metal hitting the porcelain plate echoed like a falling gavel. One by one, the influential neighbors, the country club president, and the charity committee members set down their silverware. The lavish, catered meal sat untouched, cooling rapidly in the agonizing silence. They were trapped in a room with a ticking legal bomb, and they were desperately calculating how quickly they could reach the exit. The silence that followed my forensic breakdown of the federal statutes hung in the dining area like a physical weight. In the affluent enclaves of Minnesota, raising one voice is considered the ultimate social sin. Conflict is meant to be handled with passive remarks and tight smiles. But the stark, unvarnished truth I just exposed stripped away my father's final layer of pretense. Richard's visage morphed from a pale ghost into a deep, apoplectic shade of purple. The veins on his forehead bulged, pressing against his skin. The patriarchal authority he spent decades cultivating had just been meticulously dismantled in front of the exact audience he worshipped. The regional judge, the hospital administrator, and the wealthy neighbors were all sitting at his table, witnessing his unmasking as a fraudulent debtor. He lost his mind. Richard slammed his closed fist onto the polished mahogany surface. The impact rattled the fine bone china. The crystal goblets chimed in sharp, discordant notes. Several guests physically jumped in their leather chairs, startled by the sudden eruption of rage. "Get out of my house," he screamed. His voice was raw, echoing off the vaulted timber ceilings. The polished country club gentleman vanished, leaving only a cornered, desperate man. "You ungrateful, wretched girl! Get out of my house right now!" This was the moment I had engineered. This was the precise reaction I anticipated when I built my strategy. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I sat at the head of the arrangement observing his breakdown with the detached fascination of a clinician studying a predictable pathogen. Over the course of my career as a fraud examiner, I had sat across from corrupt chief executive officers who threw heavy glass ashtrays across boardrooms. I had watched embezzling politicians weep and yell when presented with their own hidden bank statements. The rage of a guilty man is always the same. It is loud, hollow, and entirely powerless against a paper trail. My complete lack of emotional reaction seemed to infuriate him further. He expected me to cower. He expected the ingrained childhood programming to activate, forcing me to apologize and retreat into the shadows. Throughout my youth, Richard used this very cabin to dictate my worth. Every holiday he sat in the seat I currently occupied, carving the roasted bird, distributing praise to David and Vanessa, while tossing me the conversational scraps. He used his supposed financial superiority as a weapon to demand obedience. He did not realize the weapon now belonged to me. I reached into the thick black auditing binder one final time. I bypassed the federal bankruptcy filings and the forged collateral affidavits. I retrieved a distinct stack of heavy ivory paper. The document was bound by a blue legal cover bearing the embossed seal of a prominent Minneapolis corporate law firm. It was the original notarized mortgage buyout contract, the master deed of trust executed 4 years ago when Richard was 60 days delinquent and facing an imminent foreclosure auction. I placed the heavy ivory paper onto the white linen tablecloth. I pressed my index finger against the bottom edge and slid it smoothly down the wood. It glided past the steaming porcelain gravy boat and came to a stop directly in front of my father. "Look at the managing entity registry," I instructed, keeping my vocal tone remarkably even. My voice did not need to rise to command the space. The calm certainty of my words sliced through the lingering echoes of his shouting. Richard looked down at the ivory paper. His chest heaved with heavy, erratic breaths. His eyes scanned the bold text at the top of the page. He saw the name Apex Holdings, and right beneath it, he saw the recorded primary manager signature, my signature. "It has not been your house for 4 years, Dad," I stated. The words landed with the crushing gravity of a falling anvil. "I formed the blind trust. I paid the arrears when you were liquidating your retirement accounts just to buy country club drinks. I covered the principal and the interest every single month while you pretended to be a self-made titan." Susan let out a stifled whimpering sound from the opposite end of the room. She pressed a linen napkin over her mouth, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. I own the debt. I continued locking my gaze onto my father. I am the bank, and you just tried to steal from me. The regional judge slowly leaned back in his chair, distancing himself from Richard, as if my father had suddenly become radioactive. The hospital administrator, who had spent the entire evening treating David like a demigod, now looked at the young neurosurgery fellow with profound pity. The Golden Family was a hollow theatrical production funded entirely by the daughter they deemed unworthy of an invitation. Richard opened his mouth to formulate a response, but his vocal cords failed him. The reality of his situation short-circuited his brain. He was standing in a residence he did not own, hosting a lavish, catered party he could not afford, surrounded by influential peers who now knew he was a destitute fraudster. Before the stifling quiet could stretch any further, a new sound pierced the heavy atmosphere. It was not the polite chime of a suburban doorbell. It was a heavy, authoritative pounding echoing from the front entryway. The rhythmic thud of a closed fist striking the thick oak door vibrated through the floorboards. The attendees turned their heads toward the foyer. The rhythmic pounding occurred a second time, louder and more insistent. Susan, paralyzed by shock, remained glued to her seat. Greg stared at his empty wine glass, pretending he was invisible. One of the hired catering staff members, assuming it was a late-arriving neighbor, hurried out of the kitchen to answer the summons. I watched the young waiter turn the brass handle and pull the heavy entry inward. A blast of frigid winter wind swept into the warm cabin, carrying a swirl of white snowflakes. Stepping through the threshold were two uniformed deputies from the local county sheriff's civil division. Their heavy tactical boots crunched against the hardwood floor, leaving small puddles of melting slush in their wake. They wore dark winter enforcement jackets, adorned with silver utility badges, catching the light of the imported chandelier. The static crackle of their shoulder-mounted communication radios shattered the lingering jazz music playing softly from the hidden speakers. The presence of armed law enforcement in a Wayzata enclave is an anomaly. The sight of them stepping into a formal holiday dinner party is a social cataclysm. The lead deputy removed his uniform hat, brushing a layer of frost from the brim. He possessed the stern, unyielding demeanor of a man who served eviction notices for a living. He did not care about the bespoke suits or the fine bone china. He held a thick, transparent plastic folder containing a stack of official, court-ordered documents. "We are looking for Richard Paul," the deputy announced, his booming baritone projected effortlessly into the dining area. Nobody moved. The affluent neighbors sat frozen, holding their collective breath. The illusion of elite invulnerability vanished. I remained seated at the head of the arrangement, offering a slight nod toward the center of the room. The deputy followed my gaze, zeroing in on the pale, sweating man standing near the untouched roasted turkey. The law enforcement officer marched into the dining space. His boots squeaked against the polished wood. He stopped directly across from my father. "Are you Richard Paul?" the deputy asked, ensuring formal identification. Richard managed a weak, trembling nod. His rage had evaporated, replaced by the shivering compliance of a broken individual. The deputy unsealed the transparent plastic folder. He retrieved a thick, stapled packet bearing the official stamp of the county clerk office. He extended his arm, handing the paperwork directly to my father. Richard took the packet, his fingers shaking so severely the paper rustled in the quiet space. "You are hereby served with a formal notice of acceleration and eviction intent," the deputy declared, reciting the legal mandate loud enough for every single influential guest to hear. "The primary lien holder has activated the default protocol due to contractual violations. You have standard statutory deadlines to vacate the premises as outlined in the attached court order." The deputy paused, retrieving a small digital tablet from his utility belt. He tapped the screen a few times, logging the successful physical delivery of the documents. "Have a good evening, sir," the officer added, a perfunctory closing statement that felt like a final shovel of dirt thrown onto a grave. The two deputies turned around and marched back through the foyer, stepping out into the freezing blizzard. The heavy oak door swung shut behind them, latching with a decisive metallic click. Richard stood paralyzed, holding the eviction notice. The public execution of his status was now a matter of historical record. He had tried to banish me from his holiday celebration to preserve his flawless image. Instead, I had utilized the very legal systems I audited every day to systematically dismantle his life in front of the people he valued most. The main course of ruin had been served, and nobody had an appetite left. The heavy oak door clicking shut behind the departing sheriff deputies served as the starting gun for a frantic high society evacuation. In the manicured enclaves of Minnesota, wealthy individuals possess a highly tuned radar for legal contamination. Proximity to a federal crime is a social pathogen they avoid at all costs. The suffocating silence inside the formal dining room lasted for perhaps 10 seconds before the survival instincts of the elite kicked into overdrive. The regional judge was the first person to move. He understood optics and self-preservation better than anyone else in the cabin. He stood up, pushing his leather chair back with a loud scraping sound that shattered the quiet. He did not look at my father. He did not offer a polite farewell or a sympathetic nod. "I just remembered my wife left the secondary oven on at our residence," he announced to the empty air. His excuse was absurd and transparent, but in this culture, a flimsy lie is the accepted currency of an abrupt departure. He walked swiftly toward the foyer, bypassing the mahogany coat closet entirely. He was unwilling to spend an extra 30 seconds searching for his cashmere overcoat. He preferred to face the biting winter freeze in his suit jacket rather than remain in the epicenter of an active fraud investigation. His sudden movement broke the invisible dam holding the rest of the attendees hostage. The hospital administrator followed suit instantly. He had spent the entire evening treating my brother David like a prestigious medical prodigy. Now he looked at David as if the young neurosurgery fellow carried a highly infectious disease. The administrator muttered a vague sentence about an early morning staff meeting and practically sprinted toward the exit. David stood near the grand staircase, his bespoke, tailored suit suddenly looking very foolish as his primary career benefactor abandoned him without a second glance. The Golden Boy status dissolved the moment his family name became a liability. The silver-haired investor Greg had been trying to woo did not even bother inventing an excuse. He picked up his mobile phone, dialed his driver, and walked out the front door, leaving his crystal wine glass untouched on the pristine linen tablecloth. Within 3 minutes, the mass exodus transformed the meticulously curated prep party into a chaotic scramble. The influential neighbors, the country club charity board members, and the local business owners fled the scene. They abandoned half-eaten plates of roasted root vegetables and artisan breads. They left expensive imported wine breathing in crystal decanters. The driveway outside became a chaotic symphony of revving engines and crunching tires as a dozen luxury sport utility vehicles reversed hastily into the snow-covered street, eager to escape the radioactive scandal. I remained seated at the head of the immense mahogany table, watching the evacuation with clinical detachment. I had designed this audit to expose the hidden liabilities, but the speed at which their social circle abandoned them was a fascinating sociological metric. Their entire universe was transactional. The moment the currency of their prestige bounced, their friends vanished. As the taillights of the final departing vehicle faded into the winter storm, a ragged, guttural sound echoed through the cavernous cabin. Susan collapsed into a nearby dining chair. Her tailored emerald dress bunched up around her waist, losing its elegant silhouette. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The tears flowed with a fierce, torrential energy, smearing her pristine makeup. Her shoulders heaved as she wailed into the quiet room. This was a significant, observable pebble in the avalanche of their ruin. My mother was not crying out of remorse. She was not weeping because she had forged signatures or betrayed her youngest daughter. She was experiencing a profound narcissistic injury because her humiliation had been broadcast to the exact audience she worshipped. Susan had spent 2 decades climbing the Wyzetta social ladder. She endured countless tedious charity committee meetings and hosted hundreds of exhausting luncheons to secure her position among the local elite. She treated her family as props in her endless theatrical production of suburban perfection. Now the curtain had fallen, and the audience had fled in disgust. Her tears were a mournful eulogy for her revoked country club membership and her shattered reputation. She would never recover from the stigma of an eviction notice served during a holiday dinner. I watched her cry, feeling a strange, hollow calm. A fraud examiner learns early on that you cannot extract genuine accountability from someone who only values optics. The sound of my mother weeping acted as a catalyst for the final fracture in the room. The golden couple standing near the roaring stone fireplace was about to break under the immense atmospheric pressure. Vanessa had remained frozen by the hearth during the entire exodus. Her eyes darted from the eviction notice, trembling in my father's hand, to the forged collateral affidavits resting on the table. The thick layers of her suburban propaganda were peeling away, exposing the terrifying reality underneath. She was not just losing her aesthetic lakeside sanctuary, she was intimately tied to the fraudulent secondary loan application. Vanessa knew Greg was struggling, but she had chosen willful ignorance. She preferred to post matching pajama photos on social media rather than review a bank statement. Now, the truth was inescapable. Greg was bankrupt. The white Range Rover was leased. The tech incubator was a mirage. And worse, Vanessa realized her own legal exposure. She was the one who had coordinated the property appraisal. She was the one who helped Greg submit the digital files. She was implicated in a federal conspiracy, and she was about to be homeless. Greg attempted to run his standard crisis management protocol. He took a step toward his wife, reaching out with his hands raised in a pacifying gesture. He plastered a reassuring, authoritative smile onto his face, relying on the arrogant charm that had kept his personal Ponzi scheme afloat for years. "Babe, just take a breath," he said, using his smooth, startup pitch voice. "This is a temporary setback. We can pivot. I know a guy in commercial restructuring who can file an emergency injunction. We just need to leverage a new strategy." And, "Do not tell me to pivot," Vanessa shrieked. Her voice cracked, hitting a hysterical pitch that silenced our mother weeping. The carefully curated Wyzetta housewife persona evaporated instantly. Vanessa lunged toward the mantel, grabbing her half-full crystal wine glass. With a sharp, decisive motion, she hurled the goblet directly at her husband. Greg ducked, raising his arms to shield his face. The heavy crystal missed his head by a fraction of an inch and smashed against the stone fireplace. The fragile glass exploded into 100 glittering shards. Dark red wine splashed across the gray stone, looking remarkably like fresh blood. Droplets stained the collar of his tailored fleece vest. "You lied to me," she screamed, her chest heaving with unbridled fury. "You told me the venture capital was secure. You told me the bridge loan was just a formality. You made my parents forge those papers, and now the sheriff is throwing us into the snow. You have nothing. You are a broke, pathetic loser." Greg lowered his arms, his face flushing red with a sudden defensive anger. His ego, punctured by the public emasculation, retaliated. "I did what I had to do to pay for your lifestyle," he shouted back, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You spend $10,000 a month on clothes and club fees and leased cars you cannot afford. You knew the accounts were empty, Vanessa. Do not play the victim. You turned a blind eye as long as the credit cards kept working." The ugly, transactional nature of their marriage spilled onto the floor for everyone to see. Their courtship had never been rooted in genuine affection. It was a mutual con. Vanessa married Greg because he projected the image of a wealthy tech titan who could fund her endless material desires. Greg married Vanessa because her family provided the elite social network and the perceived generational wealth he needed to secure new lines of credit. They were two parasites feeding off a host that had just flatlined. "I hate you," Vanessa spat, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You ruined my life. You manipulated me into this mess. You ruined your own life," Greg sneered, wiping a drop of red wine from his cheek. "You are a fake. Your whole family is a fake. At least I tried to build something. You just sit around spending money that belongs to your sister." The mention of my name brought the argument to a grinding halt. The echo of Greg's words hung in the warm air of the cabin. Vanessa turned her head slowly, shifting her gaze away from her shattered husband. She looked across the formal dining room, past the untouched roasted turkey and the abandoned crystal flutes. Her eyes locked onto me, sitting quietly at the head of the mahogany table, with my hands resting on the black leather binder. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The anger drained from her face, replaced by a creeping, suffocating panic. The guests were gone. The golden marriage was dead. The patriarchal authority was broken. The only person left in the room with any power or resources was the sibling she had mockingly disinvited via a group text message. The house was still warm from the roaring fire, but the digital thermostat on the wall was about to initiate a very different kind of reality. My audit was finished, and the cold was finally coming to collect. The argument between my sister and her husband faded into a bitter, suffocating silence. Greg turned on his heel, crunching over the shattered crystal fragments of his wine glass. He walked toward the far end of the cabin, retreating into the shadows of the den. Vanessa stood by the hearth, staring blankly at the red wine dripping down the gray stones. The hired catering staff, having witnessed the legal spectacle and the subsequent domestic fracture, quietly packed their essential equipment and slipped out through the kitchen service door. They left the roasted turkey sitting on the dining table. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Minnesota sun dipped below the tree line. The bruised purple sky rapidly darkened into a pitch-black winter night. The temperature on the outdoor thermometer plunged past -10 degrees. Inside the cabin, a distinct metallic pinging sound echoed through the hallways. It started in the baseboards of the dining room and traveled steadily toward the grand foyer. My father looked up at the vaulted ceiling. He recognized the noise. Anyone who has survived a winter in the rural Midwest understands the ominous sound of contracting metal. The central radiators were cooling down. Maintaining a sprawling lakeside property requires a complex infrastructure. The primary heat source for the Wayzata residents was a large-capacity oil furnace located in the basement. A commercial vendor drove a tanker truck down the winding driveway every 3 weeks to fill the reservoir. Because my blind trust controlled the deed, Apex Holdings also held the vendor accounts. The utility bills were paid from my corporate ledger to ensure the property remained secure. 21 days ago, I logged into the vendor portal and suspended all future fuel deliveries. I calculated the exact consumption rate based on historical winter data. I knew the reservoir would run dry on Thanksgiving afternoon. The digital thermostat on the dining room wall clicked in a futile attempt to signal the empty furnace. The forced air vents went silent. The roaring fire in the stone hearth provided a localized pocket of warmth, but it was entirely insufficient to heat a multi-level timber structure. The ambient temperature in the cavernous living space began a rapid, unyielding descent. The cold seeped through the hardwood floors. It radiated from the expansive window panes. A thin layer of white frost began to creep up the inside of the glass, blurring the view of the frozen lake. Susan wrapped her arms around her torso. Her emerald dress offered zero insulation against the plummeting indoor climate. She shivered visibly, her teeth chattering with a faint clicking sound. The affluent matron who had spent the evening projecting unyielding prosperity now looked frail and terrified. She hurried toward the foyer closet, retrieving her heavy camel-colored cashmere coat. She draped it over her shoulders, pulling the thick collar up around her neck. Richard followed her example. He pulled a thick wool overcoat from a hanger and slipped it on over his tailored suit. They stood in the center of their pristine, formal dining room, wearing their winter outerwear, shivering as their suburban pride froze over. The physical cold was a tangible manifestation of their financial ruin. They were trapped in a museum of their own failures, surrounded by expensive artifacts that could not generate a single degree of warmth. I remained seated at the head of the mahogany table. I wore a tailored blazer spun from heavy thermal wool. I did not shiver. I watched my parents pace the floor, observing the rapid deterioration of their patriarchal hierarchy. Richard stopped pacing. He turned and looked at me. The arrogant patriarch who had pounded his fist on the table and demanded my exit just an hour prior was gone. The man standing before me was spiritually broken. He did not drop to the floor. He did not fall to his knees physically, but his posture collapsed. His broad shoulders sagged inward. The rigid spine that had carried decades of unearned superiority curved into a hollow arch of defeat. He walked slowly toward my end of the table. He pulled out the chair to my right and sat down heavily. He rested his forearms on the white linen tablecloth, staring at the thick black auditing binder. "Althea," he began, his voice a raspy whisper stripped of all authority. "Please." I turned my head to look at him. I offered no encouragement. I simply waited for the data. "You proved your point," he continued, swallowing hard. "You showed everyone. You hold the cards. But this is still your childhood home. We are still your family. It is freezing in here. We have nowhere else to go tonight. The roads are covered in ice." He reached across the table, extending his trembling hand toward mine. I pulled my hand back, placing it securely in my lap. He let his arm drop awkwardly to the wood. "I am asking you to reverse the foreclosure order," he pleaded, his eyes darting around the freezing room. "Call your attorney. Tell the sheriff it was a misunderstanding. We can fix this. I promise things will be different from now on. You will have a permanent seat at this table. We will respect your career. We will stop asking you to hide in the background. Just turn the heat back on, Alethea. Please, give us another chance." My mother stepped up behind his chair. She nodded frantically, pulling the cashmere coat tighter around her shivering frame. "We are so sorry, sweetie," she chimed in, her voice cracking. "We just want to be a whole family again." I studied their faces, analyzing the structure of their apologies. A forensic examiner learns to dissect human behavior the same way they dissect a fraudulent tax return. You look for the underlying motive. You look for the transactional currency. They were offering me respect. They were promising me a seat at the table. For 31 years, I had craved that exact validation. I had spent my youth studying late into the night, earning dual credentials, hoping my achievements would finally earn their genuine affection. I had stepped in to pay their mortgage 4 years ago, hoping the anonymous rescue would somehow heal the rift. But my analytical mind saw right through the hollow words echoing in the freezing cabin. They did not regret exiling me from Thanksgiving. They regretted getting caught. They did not respect my law degree or my auditing license. They feared the legal power those credentials represented. Richard was not offering a genuine paternal apology born of love and reflection. His capitulation was entirely transactional. He was negotiating for shelter. He was trying to barter fake affection in exchange for heating oil and a roof. "You are only apologizing because you are cold, Dad," I said, keeping my voice level and precise. "If the furnace was running and the sheriff had not knocked on the door, you would be drinking vintage wine with the regional judge right now, laughing about my absence." Richard flinched. The blunt truth severed his remaining hope. "You do not respect me," I continued, picking up the black binder. "You respect the leverage I hold. A seat at this table means nothing when the table belongs to me." I stood up from the heavy wooden chair. The leather cushion decompressed with a soft sigh. "The default stands," I declared, rendering my final verdict. "The acceleration clause is active. The eviction timeline outlined in the court order is non-negotiable." Susan let out another stifled sob, burying her face in her hands. Richard stared at the empty space on the tablecloth where my binder had rested, his eyes hollow and defeated. He had played his final card, and the transaction had been denied. I adjusted my blazer, preparing to walk out into the winter night. I had delivered the receipts. I had executed the audit. The Wyzetta illusion was permanently dismantled. But as I turned toward the foyer, a subtle movement caught my periphery. Vanessa stepped out from the shadows of the hearth. She had watched our father fail to negotiate a truce. She had watched the patriarchal authority crumble into dust. Her golden child status was now entirely worthless. She could no longer rely on her parents for financial cover. Vanessa wiped a stray tear from her cheek. She straightened her posture, leaving her shattered husband in the den. She walked slowly toward the kitchen corridor, positioning herself directly in my exit path. The desperate, calculating glint in her eye signaled a drastic shift in strategy. The patriarch had failed to barter for shelter, but the favored daughter was preparing to launch one final desperate con to save herself. The temperature inside the Wyzetta residence continued its steady decline. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored thermal blazer, preparing to navigate the grand foyer and step out into the freezing winter night. My audit was complete. The patriarchal hierarchy lay in ruins. My father sat paralyzed at the dining table, while my mother wept into her cashmere collar. I had executed my professional duty and secured my financial assets. But as I walked past the entrance to the sprawling gourmet kitchen, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking my path to the front door. It was my older sister, Vanessa. She had retreated from the den after hurling the crystal wine glass at her husband. She stood near the center island, gripping the edge of the polished marble countertop. The kitchen was an exhibition of culinary excess, featuring dual commercial ovens, a built-in espresso machine, and a massive stainless steel refrigerator. Yet the room felt sterile and unused. The ambient chill seeping through the floorboards seemed to amplify the stark, clinical lighting overhead. Vanessa looked up at me. Her appearance had undergone a radical transformation. The hysterical, shrieking wife from 10 minutes ago had vanished. In her place stood a fragile, terrified victim. Her emerald necklace sat slightly askew. A single tear traced a perfect, glistening path down her cheek, smudging her expensive mascara, just enough to elicit sympathy without ruining her photogenic features. "Alethea," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured vulnerability. "Please wait. You cannot leave yet." I stopped walking. I held the thick black leather binder securely at my side. I did not speak. I simply observed her performance, calculating the trajectory of her final con. Vanessa had utilized this exact tactical approach her entire life. Whenever the consequences of her reckless behavior threatened to tarnish her golden child status, she deployed her tears as a universal currency. When we were teenagers, she crashed our father's pristine sedan into a snowbank because she was texting. She cried so beautifully that Richard ended up blaming the municipal snowplows for failing to salt the roads. She possessed an innate ability to extract rescue from any situation by weaponizing her pretty privilege. She assumed the sisterly bond, combined with a display of total submission, would grant her immunity. "Greg is a monster," Vanessa continued, taking a tentative step toward me, her voice cracked, hitting a pitch of desperate sorrow. "He lied to me for years, Alethea. He controlled all the banking passwords. He hid the past due notices. He subjected me to severe financial abuse and kept me entirely in the dark. I had no idea he was bankrupt until you showed us that paper tonight." She paused, waiting for my facial expression to soften. When my gaze remained flat and analytical, she intensified her routine. "He manipulated Mom and Dad into signing those terrible collateral forms," she sobbed, bringing a trembling hand to her mouth. "He preyed on their trust. He used our family to fund his delusions. I am a victim here, just like you. I am going to file for a rapid divorce first thing next week. I am taking the kids and leaving him." The mention of her children was a calculated maneuver. She knew the societal expectation placed upon aunts to prioritize the welfare of their nieces and nephews. She was attempting to use her offspring as human shields to secure a real estate concession. "I understand you are angry at Dad," Vanessa pleaded, clasping her hands together in front of her chest. "But the kids need stability. They love this lakeside cabin. It is their home. Just let me and the children stay here rent-free while I navigate the divorce proceedings. You own the debt now, so you can authorize a temporary housing arrangement. We can be a real family again, just the two of us, supporting each other against him." I listened to the echo of her tearful request bouncing off the stainless steel appliances. The sheer audacity of her proposal was a fascinating study in suburban entitlement. She wanted to orchestrate a narrative where she emerged as a tragic heroine, shedding a toxic husband, while simultaneously retaining her luxurious lakeside sanctuary at my expense. She wanted me to subsidize her idyllic lifestyle while she continued to preside over the local country club charity committees. "You think Greg manipulated Mom and Dad into signing those documents?" I asked, my voice echoing with quiet precision. "Yes," Vanessa cried, nodding eagerly. "He is a predator, Alethea. He orchestrated the whole thing." I placed my black leather binder flat onto the cold marble island. I opened the cover. A forensic financial auditor does not merely examine ink on a page. In the modern era of commercial lending, transactions rely heavily on digital portals. Underwriters utilize encrypted, secure servers to transmit, receive, and verify collateral authorization forms. Wet signatures executed by a notary public are only one half of the equation. The digital transmission of those documents creates an immutable electronic footprint. I bypassed the primary mortgage deeds. I flipped past the federal bankruptcy filings. I turned to the very last section of the binder. I retrieved a single sheet of paper printed with dense lines of technical data. I slid the document across the smooth marble surface until it stopped directly under the under-cabinet lighting, illuminating the text for my sister to read. This is an electronic transmission audit log. I explained, stepping back and folding my arms across my tailored blazer. When the mezzanine lender required the secondary collateral affidavits, they utilized a secure online commercial portal. The documents had to be uploaded, verified, and digitally countersigned through a registered user session. Vanessa stared at the paper. The manufactured tears stopped flowing. Her breath hitched in her throat as her eyes scanned the sequence of numbers and technical jargon. A digital portal captures extensive metadata during every active session. I continued dissecting the evidence with clinical detachment. It records the exact duration of the login. It captures the media access control address, which serves as a unique fingerprint for the specific hardware device accessing the server. And most importantly, it logs the originating Internet Protocol address. I pointed a finger at the highlighted row of data near the center of the page. The Internet Protocol address recorded during the submission of the forged collateral forms traces directly to the private wireless router installed in this very cabin I stated. The timestamp indicates the upload occurred at 2:14 on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks ago. Vanessa swallowed hard. The color began to drain from her cheeks. Mom and Dad were not here on that Tuesday afternoon, I noted, reciting the timeline I had verified through my investigation. They were attending a regional charity luncheon in downtown Minneapolis. I checked the event photography. They were photographed at the venue during the exact hour this digital session occurred. The silence in the gourmet kitchen grew profound. The pinging of the cooling radiators echoed from the adjacent hallway. The media access control address, registered in the server log, does not belong to a mobile phone or a generic household tablet, I said, driving the final nail into her fabricated narrative. It identifies a specific high-end laptop computer, the exact model of the leased silver laptop you carry in your designer tote bag, Vanessa. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords refused to produce a sound. The illusion of the fragile victim shattered, exposing the calculating fraudster hiding underneath. Greg did not force our parents to sign anything. I declared, my voice cold and unyielding. Greg is too incompetent to navigate a secure commercial lending portal. You coordinated this entire scheme. You organized the property appraisal. You sat at this very marble island, logged into the banking portal, and transmitted the forged affidavits. You were not a victim of financial abuse. You were the chief operating officer of a federal bank fraud conspiracy. Vanessa gripped the edge of the countertop. Her knuckles turned stark white against the dark stone. The realization that her digital footprint had betrayed her sent a shockwave of genuine terror through her system. The tears of manipulation were replaced by the wide-eyed stare of a cornered criminal. "You cannot prove I was the one typing on the keyboard," she whispered, her voice devoid of any previous sweetness. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to cling to plausible deniability. I reached into the binder and produced a printed screenshot. It was a social media post harvested from her public profile. It featured a photograph of a steaming cup of coffee sitting next to her silver laptop, right here, on this kitchen island. Look at the timestamp on your own post. I instructed setting the photograph next to the audit log, 2:16 in the afternoon, exactly 2 minutes after the fraudulent documents were successfully transmitted to the underwriters. You uploaded a federal felony, and then you posted a lifestyle update for your country club friends. The evidence was absolute. Her pristine image, her social standing, her freedom were all resting on the cold marble counter. "Please," she begged, dropping the hostile tone. Her voice shrank into a hollow, terrified whimper. "Alethea, I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. Just do not show this to anyone." I picked up the audit log and the social media screenshot, placing them back into my secure binder. I closed the heavy leather cover with a definitive thud. "I am not interested in negotiating with you, Vanessa," I replied, my tone devoid of any familial warmth. "You tried to steal my property to fund your superficial life. Then you tried to blame your own parents and your husband to save your skin." I picked up the binder and turned toward the kitchen exit. I paused at the threshold, looking back at the shivering golden child of the Paul family. "It is currently 8 o'clock on Thanksgiving night," I stated, delivering my final, non-negotiable ultimatum. "The commercial moving crews will arrive tomorrow morning. You have until midnight tonight to pack whatever clothing fits into your leased vehicle and vacate my property." Vanessa shook her head frantically, tears of genuine panic spilling over her eyelashes. "I cannot pack a whole house in 4 hours," she cried. "Where will my kids sleep tonight?" "You can ask your country club friends for a spare room," I suggested coldly. "If you or Greg or our parents are still inside this cabin when the clock strikes 12, I will not call the local sheriff. I will send this entire black binder directly to the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crimes Division, first thing on Monday morning." I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on the gourmet kitchen and walked down the freezing hallway toward the grand foyer. The air inside the cabin had grown bitter and hostile, reflecting the true nature of the family residing within its walls. I stepped through the heavy oak door out into the dark Minnesota winter, leaving the golden child to face the immediate, devastating consequences of her own digital arrogance. The Friday following the Thanksgiving holiday is traditionally defined by frenzied consumerism. Affluent residents of the Minnesota suburbs wake early to flood luxury boutiques purchasing discounted designer goods to maintain their curated lifestyles. The sky above the Wayzata enclave broke crisp and blindingly bright, reflecting off the fresh layer of snow covering the frozen lake. The outdoor temperature stalled in the low single digits. I sat inside the heated cab of my practical sedan, watching the breath of my hired property management crew form white clouds in the frigid air. The digital clock on my dashboard switched to 8 in the morning. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out into the biting winter wind. A commercial moving van idled at the base of the driveway. 2 professional locksmiths carrying heavy metal toolboxes exited the vehicle. We marched up the stone walkway together. I did not bother to knock. The heavy oak front door stood ajar, an anomaly in this security-obsessed neighborhood. The gap in the entryway served as a glaring symptom of the chaotic scramble occurring inside. I gestured for the locksmiths to begin their work. They immediately set about dismantling the decorative brass hardware, replacing the residential deadbolts with industrial-grade commercial locks. The metallic whine of their cordless power drills echoed through the grand foyer, signaling the official transfer of power. The interior of the lakeside cabin resembled a disaster zone. The ambient climate hovered barely above freezing due to the empty oil furnace I had disabled weeks prior. Cardboard boxes and black plastic trash bags littered the expensive hardwood floors. Richard, Susan, Vanessa, and Greg had spent the entire night packing in the freezing dark. They did not dare test my midnight ultimatum regarding the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The looming threat of a white-collar indictment proved to be a highly effective motivator. The Golden family looked entirely hollowed out. Richard wore the same wool overcoat from the previous evening, his face pale and unshaven. He avoided my gaze, staring firmly at his leather shoes as he carried a small suitcase toward the exit. Greg hauled a plastic tote bin down the grand staircase, his tailored fleece vest still stained with dried red wine from the domestic dispute. Conspicuously absent from the morning scramble was my brother David. The prestigious neurosurgery fellow had fled the premises late last night, securing his own reputation and abandoning his relatives to face the eviction alone. The Golden Boy retreated the moment his benefactors lost their funding, proving his loyalty was just as transactional as their love. A sharp commotion erupted in the formal dining room, breaking the sullen silence. I followed the noise, finding my mother engaged in a frantic, tearful argument with the lead foreman of the moving crew. Susan pointed a trembling finger at the vaulted timber ceiling. The imported crystal chandelier hung above the mahogany table, catching the harsh morning sunlight and scattering prisms across the dim room. "I am taking that fixture," Susan demanded, her voice shrill and hoarse from crying. "It was imported directly from Italy. It cost $15,000. You have no right to touch it." The foreman crossed his arms, holding a sturdy aluminum clipboard. "Ma'am, we only allow the removal of personal effects, clothing, shoes, and basic toiletries. My team is required to inspect outgoing containers for flatware and artwork. Permanent fixtures stay with the premises. Those are the strict orders from the lien holder." Susan began to weep anew. The tears flowed freely, ruining her pale complexion and streaking her expensive foundation. She was not crying over the destruction of her marriage. She was not weeping over the criminal conspiracy her favored daughter had orchestrated. She wept over a piece of decorative lighting. The chandelier represented the last tangible shred of her country club status. I stepped into the dining area, my boots clicking against the wood, to intervene in the dispute. "The fixture is hardwired into the electrical grid," I stated, my voice echoing off the cold walls. Under standard real estate statutes, any item physically affixed to the property is considered a permanent fixture and transfers with the deed. If you attempt to remove it, I will deduct the replacement value from the remaining equity, which currently stands at 0. "Step away from the ladder, Susan." My mother looked at me, her eyes wide with a venomous despair. She realized her aesthetic artifacts no longer belonged to her. The illusion was stripped down to the bare studs. She lowered her trembling hand, pulling her camel-colored cashmere coat tighter around her shivering frame. She turned and walked away, clutching a small designer cosmetic bag as her only prize. The packing process was agonizingly slow and severely restricted. Because my corporate entity technically owned the furnishings, they were legally barred from removing the expensive leather sofas, the antique rugs, or the high-end electronics. They were reduced to stuffing designer clothing and expensive footwear into the trunk of Greg-leased white Range Rover. The logistics of the evacuation highlighted their sheer financial desperation. Richard had quietly sold his own luxury sedan 2 weeks prior to cover a margin call for his failing import business. Susan's vehicle was parked at a local repair shop, awaiting an expensive transmission fix they could not afford to authorize. The entire family was forced to cram into a single depreciating asset. Vanessa ushered her children out the front door, wrapping them in thick winter coats and scarves. She avoided making eye contact with me, staring strictly at the icy concrete path. The pristine Wyzetta housewife persona had evaporated, replaced by the frantic energy of a fugitive fleeing a crime scene. She climbed into the passenger seat of the sport utility vehicle, slamming the door shut with a definitive thud. Greg took the wheel, gripping the leather steering rim with white knuckles. Richard and Susan squeezed into the rear seats, surrounded by bursting plastic bags and stuffed canvas duffel bags. The rear suspension of the chassis sagged noticeably under the excessive weight of their remaining worldly possessions. I walked out onto the snowy front porch. The lead locksmith approached me, retrieving a pristine set of heavy brass keys from his utility belt. He handed them over, tipping his hat, before returning to his commercial van. The metal felt cold and dense in my palm. The weight represented absolute legal control over the domain that had tormented my youth. The engine of the Range Rover roared to life, a harsh mechanical sound breaking the quiet winter morning. Exhaust fumes plumed into the freezing air, forming a thick gray cloud behind the tailgate. Greg shifted the transmission into reverse. The tires spun briefly on the icy driveway, searching for traction before catching the pavement. I stood in total silence, watching the vehicle back into the street. They drove away down the winding, tree-lined road, the red taillights disappearing around a snowbank. They were entirely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their toxic leverage. They were permanently exiled from the affluent community they had sacrificed their youngest daughter to impress. They were driving away with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the lingering threat of a federal indictment hanging over their heads. The profound, quiet victory settled deep into my chest. The freezing wind blew across the porch, but I did not feel the chill. The Wayzata cabin belonged to me. The ledgers were clean. The audit was officially closed. A new chapter of pristine truth had just begun, and I held the only key. Late December brought a different kind of cold to Minneapolis. The frantic holiday rush had peaked and subsided, leaving behind a quiet, frozen city. I sat in the living room of my downtown condominium, watching the thick white snowflakes drift past the floor-to-ceiling glass. The frozen Mississippi River reflected the scattered amber lights of the urban skyline. A fire crackled in the modern electric hearth, casting a warm, orange glow across the polished hardwood floors. I held a heavy crystal tumbler in my right hand. The aged bourbon inside smelled of toasted oak and dark vanilla. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The liquid burned a pleasant trail down my throat, settling into a steady, comforting warmth. The quiet in my apartment was profound. It was not the tense, suffocating silence of a Wayzata dining room waiting for the next lie to drop. It was the pristine, untroubled silence of a clean ledger. The past month had unfolded with the precise, predictable rhythm of a finalized audit. The morning after the eviction, my property management crew spent 3 days erasing all physical traces of my family from the lakeside cabin. Commercial cleaning teams scrubbed the hardwood floors, removing the lingering scents of expensive designer perfumes and stale red wine. A professional staging company arrived shortly after. They removed the dark, heavy, pretentious furniture my parents used to project their fake elite status. They replaced it with bright, warm, functional pieces. They transformed the property from a sterile museum of suburban vanity into a genuine, inviting home. I listed the property on the open market during the first week of December. In a highly sought-after neighborhood like Wayzata, a pristine lakeside estate does not remain available for long. We received 3 competitive offers within 48 hours. I bypassed the cash offers from corporate developers and predatory real estate investors. I selected a proposal from a young, dual-income family. The husband worked as a pediatric oncologist, and the wife taught advanced mathematics at a local public high school. They were genuine, hard-working professionals who earned their income through tangible societal contributions rather than empty tech startup pitches. I attended the closing meeting at a reputable title company just 4 days ago. Sitting across the polished conference table from the new buyers provided a striking contrast to my own upbringing. They looked at the photographs of the stone fireplace with genuine joy, anticipating cozy winter evenings with their young children. They did not care about impressing the local country club president. They simply wanted a safe, beautiful environment to build their lives. I signed the transfer deeds with a profound sense of closure. The property was finally serving a legitimate purpose. When the escrow account cleared, the financial resolution of my 4-year investment proved highly lucrative. The wire transfer hit the Apex Holdings corporate ledger on a Tuesday afternoon. The incoming funds covered the original principal I paid to rescue the property from foreclosure. It reimbursed every single monthly installment I had silently drafted to keep the lights on and the furnace running. Beyond the baseline recovery, the competitive Wayzata real estate market yielded a substantial profit margin. The return on investment far exceeded standard market benchmarks. I had protected my capital, exposed a federal bank fraud conspiracy, and walked away with a pristine balance sheet. I took another sip of the bourbon, letting the complex flavors linger on my palate. I thought about the dual credentials framed on my office wall, integrating my forensic auditing skills into every major intersection of this ordeal proved to be the ultimate equalizer. When my family relied on emotional manipulation, I relied on verifiable data. When they orchestrated a whisper network, I harvested the digital timestamps of their federal crimes. My ability to trace hidden assets, read complex secondary lien structures, and execute precise contractual acceleration clauses transformed me from a marginalized daughter into an unstoppable force. The progression of their ruin was entirely dictated by the paper trail they carelessly left behind. They tried to fight a certified fraud examiner using country club gossip, and they lost their entire empire. My mobile phone rested on the granite kitchen counter a few feet away. The smooth glass screen remained dark for most of the evening. I had utilized my carrier settings to block the phone numbers associated with Richard, Susan, Vanessa, and Greg. I severed their primary communication lines the moment they drove away from the cabin. I had zero interest in fielding their desperate negotiations or enduring their predictable guilt trips. I excised the infection at the root. Suddenly, the phone vibrated. The sharp buzzing sound echoed off the stone countertops, breaking the tranquil silence of the room. The screen illuminated, casting a pale blue light across the dark granite. I stood up from my leather armchair, carrying my crystal tumbler. I walked over to the kitchen island and looked down at the device. The incoming message originated from a new, unknown phone number. It was an unrecognized sequence of digits bearing a local area code. I did not need to run a trace to deduce the identity of the sender. The tactical deployment of a prepaid mobile device is a standard maneuver for an individual attempting to bypass a communication blockade. I tapped the screen, unlocking the display to read the text. The message read, "Alethea, it is your mother. Please do not delete this. We are staying in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment out in the outer suburbs. Things are very tight right now. Greg is dealing with his legal issues, and Vanessa is struggling to keep the kids cheerful. I know you are angry with us, but the children did not do anything wrong. Can you find it in your heart to send a little Christmas money for your nieces and nephews? They just want a normal holiday. Please call me back. We miss you." I stared at the glowing pixels. The sheer, unyielding audacity of Susan Paul was a remarkable psychological phenomenon. She was currently facing the catastrophic fallout of a federal fraud investigation. She had lost her sprawling estate, her influential friends, and her entire social identity. Yet she still possessed the profound delusion required to reach out to the very daughter she tried to extort and demand a financial handout. She was attempting to run the exact same con 1 month later. She wrapped her greed in the festive language of the holiday season, utilizing her grandchildren as human shields to bypass my defenses. The mention of the cramped apartment was designed to paint a vivid picture of suffering, hoping to extract cash through synthetic empathy. The phrase, "find it in your heart," was the ultimate weapon of the Minnesota nice culture. It was a manipulative mandate, demanding that I prioritize familial duty over my own boundaries. They believed the holiday spirit would soften my resolve. They thought the biological connection would eventually override the ledger. They still viewed me as the quiet girl who could be shamed into compliance. I did not feel a single trace of anger. I did not feel a pang of sorrow or a twinge of guilt. The emotional strings they spent 31 years tying around my wrists had been decisively severed. I read the message with the detached clinical observation of an auditor reviewing a redundant expense report. I raised my right hand and tapped the digital menu icon in the upper corner of the messaging application. A drop-down list appeared on the screen, offering a series of administrative options. I pressed my fingertip against the red text that read, "Block this caller." A secondary prompt asked me to confirm the permanent restriction of the unrecognized number. I tapped confirm without a second thought. The message thread vanished from my inbox. The digital connection evaporated into the electronic ether, leaving no trace of their desperate suburban tragedy. I set the phone back onto the granite counter. The screen went dark, restoring the peaceful ambient lighting of the room. I walked back toward the living area, approaching the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the city streets in a layer of pristine, white, untouched frost. I raised the heavy crystal tumbler and took a final sip of the expensive aged bourbon. The warmth radiated outward from my chest, matching the glow of the electric hearth. I stood alone in the quiet of my home, free from the weight of unearned obligations and toxic illusions. The books were closed. The final audit was flawless. My ledger was perfectly clean. The story of the Wayzata Lakeside Cabin is not merely a tale of forensic accounting or a holiday dinner fractured by hidden debts. It serves as a profound mirror, reflecting the quiet crisis unfolding behind the manicured lawns and grand entryways of modern American society. We spend our entire lives building fortresses of wood and stone, decorating them with imported chandeliers, and securing them with the envy of our neighbors. But a house built upon the shifting sands of deception will inevitably collapse under the weight of its own illusions. For parents across this country, the tragedy of the Paul family serves as a stark spiritual warning. We operate in a culture that routinely measures parental success by the prestigious degrees our children hang on their office walls or the luxury vehicles parked in their driveways. The traditional family structure is intended to function as a sanctuary of unconditional love, a sacred ground for moral and spiritual development. Yet, too often, it devolves into a transactional theater of favoritism. Parents elevate the golden child, who reflects their highest worldly ambitions, whether that is a medical fellowship or a high-status marriage. In doing so, they systematically marginalize the child who dares to ask the uncomfortable questions. We label the truth-tellers as dramatic, and we sweep genuine connection under the rug of polite suburban hospitality. When we view this societal condition through the lens of a spiritual practitioner, the root of the suffering becomes glaringly obvious. When parents prioritize status over character, they inadvertently starve their children of the three essential pillars of a meaningful existence: wisdom, morality, and resilience. True parenting requires the immense courage to practice honesty and fairness, even when the truth is deeply inconvenient. Emotional awareness is not found in orchestrating a flawless holiday aesthetic or maintaining a pristine public image. It is found in looking your child in the eye and acknowledging their inherent worth, independent of their financial utility or their ability to elevate your social standing. When we raise our children to chase the hollow currency of prestige, we teach them to become skilled actors rather than authentic human beings. We teach them to pledge phantom equity in their relationships rather than build genuine substance from the ground up. To the young adults navigating the long shadows of parental favoritism, the journey of the marginalized daughter offers a definitive blueprint for personal liberation. It is agonizing to realize that the people meant to protect and nurture you view your independence as a threat to their fragile ecosystem. Society heavily conditions the overlooked child to fold, to apologize constantly, and to shrink their own potential merely to keep the peace. But maintaining a false peace only sustains an endless cycle of quiet suffering. Your path forward requires a dedicated commitment to deep self-cultivation. You must hone your wisdom to see the world exactly as it is, stripping away the layers of emotional manipulation to recognize the verifiable facts of your reality. Wisdom allows you to understand that their rejection is a reflection of their own internal poverty, not a measure of your value. You must cultivate the resilience to establish unyielding boundaries, refusing to finance the delusions of those who routinely mistreat you. Willpower is forged in the fires of saying no to the people who expect a permanent yes. And most importantly, you must guard your morality. Notice how the forensic auditor dismantled the corrupt architecture of her family, without shouting, without throwing heavy objects, and without seeking physical vengeance. She simply presented the immutable truth. She allowed the natural consequences of their dishonesty to take their inevitable course. True resilience is not about destroying the people who hurt you. It is about outgrowing the desperate need for their validation and walking out into the winter cold with a clean conscience. We live in a world desperate for authenticity, yet terrified of the raw vulnerability it requires. A spiritual perspective teaches us that all external attachments, prestige, wealth, social standing, are transient illusions. They are paper houses waiting for a strong gust of wind. The parents in our narrative lost everything because they clung to a facade. They chose the fleeting comfort of a lie over the difficult, arduous work of self-correction. When we turn our gaze inward and actively correct our own flaws, we build an internal sanctuary that no bank can ever foreclose on and no neighbor can ever judge. We develop the capacity to navigate a chaotic world with a serene mind. If this reflection resonates with the quiet battles you face in your own life, and if you find genuine strength in stories that champion truth over pretense, I invite you to subscribe and follow Morning Revenge. We continually explore the profound transformations that occur when everyday people finally decide to stop apologizing for the space they occupy and start reclaiming their own narratives. Conventional wisdom dictates that forgiveness is the ultimate virtue of a unified family, demanding that we always leave the door cracked open for those who share our bloodline. We are taught from a young age that a clean slate requires mutual reconciliation and endless patience. But perhaps true peace requires the exact opposite approach. Sometimes, the most profound act of love you can offer a toxic system is to let it starve. You do not heal a poisoned well by repeatedly drinking from it. You heal yourself by walking away and digging a new one in fertile soil. The quietest victories in life are never shared around a crowded, festive table. They are experienced alone, in the quiet glow of a winter evening, watching the snow cover the footprints of the people you finally had the courage to leave behind. Are you warming yourself by a fire you built with your own hands? Or are you just burning your own future to keep someone else comfortable?